It all started with the fact that about an hour ago, some incident occurred near the university. The young girl was very surprised when the guy suddenly proposed to her. At first, she didn't understand what he meant, but the guy's friends started making fun of her. The young man knew that the girl was a little confused, but suggested that she look around. Only now did the young girl notice that she was standing in the middle of a heart strewn with 1,000 roses. This realization suddenly made her feel very awkward, but the guy didn't pay attention to her. Instead, he opened the box and showed the magic crystal that he had been trying hard to get from the dungeon. The young man stayed late on purpose to propose and give it to the girl. However, she was more surprised by the fact that her interlocutor was in a dungeon that was not for mere mortals. The man laughed and said that no one else in the entire university could get into the dungeon. However, their conversation was suddenly interrupted by a hooded stranger who ordered the girl to leave. He bent down and began to straighten the flowers because the angle of the bend was crooked and the flower should have been placed the other way. The groom himself was so carried away by the story of his strength and abilities that he completely failed to notice the changes taking place around him. At this time, our main character straightened the flowers and was about to go on with his business. However, it was suddenly established when the young man handed him a ring and asked him to accept his love. The hero was extremely surprised by this state of affairs and even froze for a moment. The groom's friends were upset that their friend had done such a strange thing. Only after a minute of silence did the young man notice that he had accidentally proposed to a complete stranger. After this, he immediately became angry and threw the ring on the ground in front of him. The guy began to look around and search for his beloved. However, it only now dawned on him that the girl had disappeared, taking advantage of this situation. Then the groom started yelling at his friends for letting the girl go. Our hero was only worried that the flowers he had fixed were ruined again. I noticed that if everything is so neglected, then recognition cannot be successful in any case. After this, the hero leaned down and wanted to straighten the flowers, which made the groom very angry. The guy was beyond his strength, so he didn't hesitate for long and immediately hit the stranger in the face. Our hero was surprised by this because he did not expect an attack from the outside at all. It was a strong enough blow that it sent the guy flying back and falling to the ground. The groom was angry that his proposal failed because of a stranger. That's why he started beating up the guy who just wanted to help and fix the flowers. The beating lasted for some time. The groom was supported by his friends. Still, the guys decided to stop so as not to accidentally kill the guy. After that, they just laughed at such a weakling and went about their business. Our hero thought he was going to die. He was cold. He couldn't even move his fingers. However, something suddenly happened and the guy suddenly stopped feeling pain. Suddenly, everything around seemed to become dark and a bright light appeared right before the hero's eyes. At first, he thought it was some kind of hallucination, but everything looked very similar to the information window from the game. Meanwhile, the same failed bride and her bodyguards ran back to the scene of the incident. During her escape, the girl saw that the stranger was being attacked, so she wanted to help him. However, now they ran up and saw no one around, only flowers lying on the ground. The bodyguards even doubted the girl's words, but the flowers said otherwise. The defense suggested that the boys left the flowers and candles and walked away. There were no bloodstains on the ground. It was very suspicious, but another bodyguard noticed that it was time for the girl to return home. She agreed with them, but asked the guys to check the information about this incident tomorrow. After this, the bride went home, never knowing what had really happened. And by this time, our hero returned to his home and was sitting on the bed. He had been seeing the information window in front of him for a long time and could not get rid of it. Even if he hid under the bed, it would appear right from under the sheets. You can close pop-up windows in the browser, but this didn't work. Even if the guy closed his eyes, he could still see this window right in front of him. There were a huge number of pop-up windows that notified about the presence of unread messages. After the young man looked at his status, looked at his skills, he was able to close all the pop-up windows. Only after that he got tired of it, threw himself down, covered himself, and sighed with relief. The hero was incredibly happy that all the messages had disappeared, because his head was already starting to hurt. However, the guy did not understand what had happened to him because he was beaten for real, and after this window appeared, he completely recovered all his injuries. Just as he thought this, another new window appeared right in front of his face. The hero immediately jumped up on the bed and was very disappointed by his return. He was annoyed by the appearance of 3 new notifications, but he still decided to look at them one by one. Only after watching could the guy close all the pop-up windows and move on with his life in peace. Just as he was rejoicing at his freedom, the notification window appeared in front of him again. The hero thought that it was his imagination, which would pass immediately after he had a good night's sleep. That's why the young man turned back into bed, covered himself with a blanket, and went to sleep. It was around midnight when the hero tried to sleep, and there was a notification hanging in front of his face. After 2 hours, the picture had not changed at all, except that the young man still could not fall asleep. I got out of bed, terrified that I couldn't close the notification and relax. He was annoyed that it didn't disappear, so the guy decided to take a look. Sleepy, with huge dark circles under his eyes, he opened the message. It said that the guy had one newbie task available. To complete the task, it was necessary to achieve 10% mastery in performing one specific movement. Since childhood, the hero hated such reminders of uncompleted tasks, and unread messages irritated him. However, he had no choice. The guy decided that if he completed the task, everything would be fine. The guy didn't understand why the app was bothering him so much because it was just a basic technique. However, what was strange was that he began to feel that power was filling his fists. The force, angle, and correct posture of the blow instantly formed in his mind. The guy began to repeat the movement over and over again just to complete the task. At 2 a.m., he started training and performed the movements through pain, sweat, and fatigue. This continued all night. Only in the morning, the guy was able to breathe calmly and sit down to rest. He immediately looked out of his window to check how he had completed the task. Tony hated leaving things unfinished, so he decided to finish this one and worked on it until school started. Upon arrival, his girlfriend immediately attacked him, noticing that the guy had received a bad grade. They argued again because the hero was selective about his grades. Tony was already getting good grades in math, but he wanted to get the maximum score because he was not satisfied with the rest of his subjects. Then a classmate suggested that the guy come over to her place and study English together. However, he refused and said that he could not study other subjects until he got a perfect score in the previous one. The friend was not happy with this answer, but she did not expect anything else. That same evening, our hero had his order delivered right to his door. It turned out to be a large punching bag, which the guy installed himself. Immediately after installing the new equipment, the young man decided to try it out. He put on special gloves and began to further practice basic techniques. This went on for several days in a row until Tony had ruined all the bags he had ordered. During this time, even his special gloves were completely worn out, and abrasions appeared on the guy's hands. However, he was happy and smiling, hoping that he had achieved 100% completion of the task. However, I was shocked when I saw that I could only complete the task when I reached 300% and moved on to the next level. Just at this time, his girlfriend, who was worried about him, knocked on his door. Tony hadn't shown up at school for a few days, so she decided to visit him at home. As soon as he opened the doors, the girl immediately saw that he looked like all the life had been sucked out of him. At that very moment, Tony fell exhausted onto the girl's shoulder. The friend was a little confused by the guy's unexpected behavior, but she understood him. The first thing she decided to do was feed her friend and give him a good rest. They sat together in the establishment and waited until the hero could eat. Because of his illness, the young man was forced to lay out all his things in perfect order before using them. Immediately after this, he began to very quickly absorb food one after another. The girl looked at him and was glad that she had such a good friend. Tony ate all the food and sat back on the couch, rubbing his stomach. Immediately after this, he reminded him that he did not like to remain in debt and asked how he could repay him for the food. The girl couldn't answer right away, so she asked for a little time to think. She looked to the side, killing slot machines, and asked for one toy as a token of gratitude. Tony agreed to this, so the young men stood up, paid, and headed to the slot machines. The young man was extremely focused and emitted a very powerful aura. He gathered energy for a while, then suddenly opened his eyes and rushed to attack. Tony handled the slot machine like a pro, grabbing the toys with ease. The schoolgirl was amazed at how professionally the guy played. However, she was annoyed when the very first toy suddenly fell and did not reach the exit. However, Lucy stopped and said that this was her friend's special plan. After 5 minutes, the girl herself was convinced that the guy was deliberately stacking the toys on top of each other at the very edge. The schoolgirl didn't understand what the point was in putting toys in a row if you couldn't even take them out. However, he did not listen to her completely and asked his friend which of these rabbits she wanted to get. However, the girl was already planning to impress the schoolgirl, so she told him to pull out absolutely all the rabbits for her. After this, the hero took on the most important task. He deftly controlled the toy, and the schoolgirl stood next to him and prompted him. With one movement, our hero sent the toy into a circular rotation. Then he took aim, released his claws, and used his last toy to knock down all the previous hairs. They all fell together into a cell from where they could be taken out and kept for oneself. Lucy and Tony were very happy with their victory. The schoolgirl was very impressed with her skills. My friend said that she is keeping one rabbit for herself and can give all the others to the girl. The schoolgirl was very grateful for such a wonderful gift and happily accepted it. After this, the friends said goodbye to the girl and went home. Lucy hugged the rabbit tenderly to her chest and enjoyed the atmosphere. She hesitantly asked Tony if it was true that he had recently been beaten up by a bully. However, the guy replied that she shouldn't think about it. Nothing terrible had happened. He walked the girl to her house and said that he would not go upstairs with her. He also reassured his friend and promised that he would definitely come to school tomorrow. After this, the guy said goodbye to Lucy and left her alone with the rabbit. A whole night passed and a new day came when Tony promised to return to school. At the entrance, near the fence, stood that same hooligan with his friends and laughed. The subordinates heard that the boy they beat did not die, but did not go to school for several days. A young girl appeared in front of them, ordering the hooligans never to touch that guy. At first, the bandits didn't even understand how to react to the fact that some schoolgirl was threatening them. However, they then burst out laughing because the girl imagined herself to be someone important. The main bully stepped forward and said that whoever threatened him would face consequences. He leaned over the girl and said that he would forgive her this time only because she was very sweet. However, he then tried to grab her and said that the schoolgirl should come and play with them. At that time, Tony returned to school as if nothing had happened and was walking down the corridor. Classmates looked at the boy and discussed rumors that he had recently been beaten. However, Tony did not pay attention to these conversations and first of all went to the restroom. There he calmly washed himself and looked at his reflection in the mirror to tidy himself up. A skill window was displayed before his eyes, indicating that his skills had been increased due to the completion of the task. Suddenly, the same hooligans who had beaten up the guy a few days ago entered that very toilet. They recognized the schoolboy who had disturbed them a few days ago. The hooligans did not expect to meet the guy in such a place, so they believed that the world really is a small place. In the hands of one bully, Tony saw the rabbit he had recently won for Lucy. He immediately guessed that this rabbit clearly did not come from a machine gun. The hooligan admitted that he recently met with his friend who dared to threaten him. Tony got angry because it really was Lucy's doll. Before he had time to come to his senses, the bully was already about to start another fight with him. The guy pressed his left fist to his chin and thrust his right fist forward. However, this time Tony easily managed to dodge at the last moment and avoided the blow. After countless training sessions, these blows seemed to him to be quite mediocre and weak. The hero took a couple of steps back and assumed a fighting stance to defend himself. The bully was amazed that the guy still wanted to fight him, so he ordered all his subordinates to attack simultaneously in order to finish him off faster. The boys obeyed their commander and rushed to attack the hero from all sides. However, Tony has not been training for nothing for the last few days. They are a threat to him. He pulled his left fist back, then turned his body and thrust it forward sharply. The guy hit the bully with such force that he instantly lost several teeth. Immediately after that, he flew back several meters and fell to the ground. Before his subordinates had time to come to their senses, the schoolboy began to beat up the bully further. He struck blow after blow completely without holding back his strength. Tony beat all the hooligans unconscious and stopped only after that. Only at this moment, the leader said that the guy had misunderstood everything. However, before he could finish speaking, he lost consciousness along with his subordinates. It turned out what really happened yesterday afternoon when Lucy came to the hooligans. The girl was far from weak, so she was not afraid at all and attacked first. It was during the fight that her beloved rabbit broke away and got lost somewhere in the yard. So now the girl was sitting in class and reproaching herself for having managed to lose Tony's gift. She explained to her classmate that she had lost her very important doll on the way. At that moment, the class monitor entered the classroom and said that some guy was looking for Lucy. The girl raised her head and saw her friend Tony standing next to her. She was very happy to see him, so she immediately perked up. The girl jumped up and ran to meet Tony, which greatly surprised her classmates. The guy said he heard that she was looking for trouble with some hooligans the previous night. The guy reached forward and gave the girl her pink rabbit. Lucy was very happy about the return of her missing item and thanked the guy. However, he immediately asked her to be more careful because he would not be able to return it so quickly next time. However, Lucy was not worried because she understood perfectly well that she could ask her friend for another new one. Immediately after this, Tony said goodbye to the girl and headed towards the exit of the educational institution. At this time, he learned that he had moved to a new level and the next stage of the task was about to appear. However, the guy was upset by the fact that before starting a new level of the task, it was necessary to complete the intermediate training. Especially for this purpose, he decided to go to the sports center of their city. In the boxing gym, the guy decided to train combination punches, which were much more difficult than regular exercises. His left uppercut was already 300% developed, so he needed to move on. First, he decided to practice the right uppercut, then move on to combination punches. His energy returned. The boy was more concerned that his OCD had worsened. The girls in the gym were discussing the newcomer, who had been training for the third day in a row. Besides them, the sports guys who were involved in boxing here also paid attention to him. One of them was particularly interested in the newcomer who had attracted so much attention. He watched closely as Tony practiced his punches over and over. Suddenly, the guy decided to interfere with his training and came close to the bag. The hero was very surprised by the appearance of a stranger who interrupted his training. This boxer told the hero that he was doing the exercises incorrectly. It was the city's first hard boxing champion who wanted to teach the boy real boxing. However, Tony needed to continue to improve his punching skills, so he asked the champion not to interfere with him. The athlete was furious at being rejected and told to leave. Vanessa was at home playing a keyboard instrument. Her fingers fluttered over the keys, and their translation produced a beautiful melody. Suddenly, her training was interrupted by an employee who entered the office and addressed his mistress. The man apologized for the intrusion and noted that he had found the person the girl had spoken of. This changed everything immediately, so Vanessa broke away from what she was doing and decided to follow him. And at this time, the boxing champion, irritated by the newcomer's refusal, challenged him to a fight. Tony was surprised that this athlete was going to arrange a fight with him. However, the man said that he was not going to fight the guy, but to teach him real boxing. All the people present around them were surprised by this turn of events. At this time, Vanessa Fan entered the boxing hall, surprising everyone present. Champion saw the main star of his school, so he wanted to show off in front of her. Without any further warning, he suddenly got into a fighting stance and swung his fist. Tony barely managed to block before his opponent's blow fell on him. The champion was very surprised that the guy managed to block his punch. Tony noticed that during a real fight, his progress increased faster, so he began to egg the champion on. The athlete was a little embarrassed that the guy was not afraid of him and openly rushed into battle. The spectators were also not thrilled that the champion would have to compete with a newcomer. Vanessa also noticed that Tony was able to withstand the wrestler's blow with ease. The fight became more and more interesting when new spectators appeared in the hall. Vanessa, Tony, and the gym champion turned their attention to the one who had just entered. It turned out to be the great fighter brother Bin, nicknamed Tiger. The man was inspired by the fight between the two guys, so he wanted to join them. In fact, this brother was not in the hall by accident. It all happened because of one evening. The guy was in his club when that same hooligan asked him for help. He offered him a ring as payment for Bean to take care of one guy. The fighter was impressed that in gratitude for his help, he was offered a ring with a magic crystal, which was difficult to obtain. The hooligan admitted that he bought it for $200,000 on the underground black market specifically to show his respect. His honesty greatly amused Bin, so he decided not to hold back his emotions. The guy grabbed the bully tightly around the neck and promised to fulfill his request. Therefore, the audience knew perfectly well that the opponent of the bandit Bin was practically doomed to defeat. The champion wanted to protect his hall and everyone present, so he stepped forward towards it. However, the bandit did not want to listen to this guy, so he ordered him to fly off the road. Instead, he asked those present who Tony was and where to find him. Only now did it dawn on everyone that the bandit had come into the hall not just like that, but for a specific person. Those present were very surprised that it turned out to be that very newcomer. Bin immediately realized that everyone was paying attention to this skinny guy for a reason, and turned to him. Tony showed no fear and asked why Bean was looking for him. The guy admitted that he didn't want to create problems, but in gratitude for some help, he was promised a ring with a magic crystal of the dungeon. Vanessa and Tony immediately recognized the very ring with which the bully proposed to the girl. Meanwhile, the bandit ordered his assistants to surround Tony and not let him escape. The guys with bats immediately obeyed the order and stood on both sides of the hero. The champion tried to protect the boy and said that on school grounds he was responsible for the safety of everyone present. However, the bandit did not even let him finish his sentence and immediately hit him. It was completely against the rules and very cruel, so the audience screamed in horror. The champion fell to the floor, and the bandit was about to finish him off from above with his fists. However, at the last moment, Tony stopped his fist with one hand and told him that he should only attack him. Bean wasn't about to fight by all the rules, so he reached into his pants for his hidden weapon. He pulled out an iron pipe and tried to hit the hero with it with all his might. However, the guy successfully dodged the blows and retreated back. The bandit was terribly irritated by this, so he decided to call on his strength to help and tore his shirt with his muscles. The guy could use magical techniques, so now he was concentrating all his power in the pipe. Suddenly, from a small stub, it turned into a real long, sharp spear. Everyone present was very surprised that the pipe stub suddenly grew larger and did not understand what was happening. In fact, Bandit was called the sixth king of weapons for his abilities. Vanessa's assistant noticed that this guy was gifted, but he had not fully awakened his ability. Several decades ago, the world suddenly changed and various monsters began to appear. Some people began to discover superpowers in themselves to overcome them. It was precisely these people who were called gifted, thanks to their suddenly discovered powers. Superpowers can only be awakened once and are divided into levels from the weakest to the strongest. Moreover, gifted ones who have reached the highest rank are capable of becoming the supreme ruler of all humanity, surpassing all ruling classes. A traveling sorcerer told Bin that as long as he grew stronger, he would be able to go beyond the capabilities of the gifted. Therefore, the power of awakening gave him a strong physique and the ability to strengthen weapons. That's why the guy was so confident in his abilities and attacked the newcomer without hesitation. He used his internal energy, which allowed him to apply the skills. The champion watched the fight between the opponents and was impressed that the newcomer was able to cope with what even he could not withstand. However, he wanted to help the guy and shouted to him that the bandit was attacking with the intent to kill. Tony has been able to dodge all the blows quite successfully so far. However, the guy wasn't going to just stand there and dodge forever. He waited for the right moment and decided to counterattack his opponent. The first thing Tony did was strike Bean's weapon itself, knocking it out of his hands. Immediately after this, the guy swung a second time to attack the enemy himself. The champion was surprised to see that the newcomer had completely adopted his fighting style. Everything happened very quickly, so in a few moments the hero managed to hit the bandit in the chest several times. With his final blow, he was able to break the bandit's spear and simultaneously complete his intermediate combination training. However, this was not enough for the guy, so he continued to strike his opponent, raising his level of perception of physical fitness higher and higher. Tony masterfully practiced punches with both hands, reproducing everything he had learned during training. The last blow was especially powerful, knocking out his opponent. Tony only stopped after she completed the intermediate combination workout at 300%. The young man's amazing strength made the bandit think that he was one of the awakened ones. He even thought that this newcomer belonged to the Fan family fighters. However, Tony replied that he had no idea what Bean and his company were talking about. Bean admitted that he had lost his fight and was planning to retire from the boxing gym. His assistants helped him and led him by the arms because the boy was not able to move independently. And Tony, as if nothing had happened, adjusted his punching bag and was about to continue training. Vanessa was impressed by this fight, thinking that the guy was hiding his true strength. The girl went back to her room but ordered the employee to watch the guy. After this, everything returned to order, and the spectators went to their places to continue their activities. At this time, the bandit was impressed that he had met a real gifted person. The guys were heading to their club when suddenly a stranger appeared behind them and asked them to stop. He showed his ID, and it turned out that the guy in the suit belonged to the Fan family. At one time, Bin dreamed of getting into the House of Fun, but was refused because he was not fully awakened. The man in the suit warned that the boy had broken the rules of the Awakening Association, but the first time he would only receive a warning. After some time, Tony finished his workout and walked out of the gym into the street. Vanessa was already waiting for him there, and she approached the guy and spoke to him first. She said she wanted to thank him for his help a few days ago. However, the hero looked as if he had seen the most terrible creature in the world. He tried to get away from the girl and not look at her, not talk to her. Vanessa wasn't very pleased that the guy looked like he'd seen something nasty. She decided to ignore him and introduced herself to him, thanking him for his help. However, Tony didn't listen to her at all. All his attention was focused on something else. He looked at the girl's green blouse, which flashed before his eyes. The guy was irritated by the fact that the neckline of her blouse was asymmetrical. Tony resisted the urge to reach out and straighten him out. Vanessa did not notice his suffering and asked why the guy was behaving like that. After a while, Tony couldn't hold back and screamed loudly. Immediately after this, he extended his hand to the girl and placed it on her shoulder. The guy straightened the girl's blouse, but she had already managed to misunderstand his actions. Vanessa swung her arm and slapped our hero with all her might. The girl was very angry that the guy dared to touch her body without her permission. And at this time, the girl's bodyguards were watching them from the bushes. They were ready to intervene in their conversation, but they held back with all their might. Vanessa screamed loudly at Tony for daring to touch her like that. However, he made a disgusting expression on his face and told the girl to stop dressing like that. Vanessa misunderstood his words and remarked that what she wore was none of his business. However, she decided to give the guy a chance to explain himself, since he had once helped her. But Tony decided not to use it, simply turning around and walking away. Vanessa was furious that this guy had groped her and then dared to ignore her. The girl immediately turned to her bodyguards for help and ordered them to watch the guy. After everything that happened, the hero was happy to just walk calmly through the city. During the last training session, the guy's perception and physical fitness improved by several levels. Tony noted that real combat has the advantage of allowing you to improve your skills faster. However, immediately after this, he receives a new task that needed to be completed. Also, the guy recently noticed that the stronger his disorder, the faster his perception, the faster he increases his level. He also discovered that using perception, he could usually learn new skills simply by observation. Thanks to this, his skills can improve many times over. Tony felt like there was no limit, and he could exceed his 100% limit several times in a row. If he continues to train, he may even exceed his plan by 300%. The guy had no idea what this system was or what it wanted from him, but he believed that he could go beyond it and free himself from pop-up notifications. To complete this task, he needed to prepare properly and try to complete all the tasks as quickly as possible. Because of this, Tony created his own daily routine and started training at 5 a.m. Then he would take a shower and do housework until 8 a.m. The guy also got himself a special planner to mark the completion of all his daily tasks. Only after the plan was fully completed could the guy breathe a sigh of relief and go about his business. This time, too, the young man completed his morning routine and headed towards the elevator. There he was met by an old woman neighbor who asked if the guy had closed the door before leaving. This triggered a new fad in his head, and Tony felt as if he had been electrocuted. He immediately rushed back into the apartment to check whether he had really closed the door. The guy was convinced of this, then went to school, and only there was he able to breathe a sigh of relief. Suddenly, a group of guys from the boxing gym who had been bothering him recently appeared right in front of him. However, instead of fighting, they suddenly bowed to him and greeted him. The champion announced that the members of their boxing club had unanimously chosen Tony as their new leader. They announced it to everyone and hoped that their new leader would lead them to a bright future. But to Tony, it looked like they were attacking him and constantly demanding something. So the guy asked to leave him alone and tried to run away. On the way, he met his friend Lucy, who greeted him cheerfully. However, Tony walked past her, trying to hide from the crowd of boxers. The school children were already discussing rumors that this guy was the heir to 4 families. The hero tried to hide from his pursuers around the corner and did not understand when he became so unlucky. Suddenly, strange men approached him and introduced themselves as envoys of the Fan family. They handed him an invitation to join the training squad for the Awakened. The men explained that after the monsters awakened several years ago, the world was no longer so safe. That's why they invited the guy to join them, but he was interested in something else. Tony wanted to know what he would get in return for his participation in their club. The strange men in front of Tony immediately opened the box in which the offerings for him lay. It was a perfect set of blades, perfect color, perfect shape, even perfect size. Our hero didn't want to refuse such a wonderful gift, so he grabbed it. Tony promised to think about the Fan family's offer to join them. Immediately after this, the guy said goodbye to the strange man, took the chest, and went about his business. Suddenly, a notification appeared in front of him that the guy had crossed some strange barrier and energy fluctuations had been detected. The notification said that there were enemies around him and that he needed to prepare for battle. Tony looked around but saw only one man in traditional clothing in front of him. He immediately realized that there was something clearly wrong with this guy in front of him. However, before Tony could finish his thought, he felt danger from behind. The boy grabbed his new chest more tightly and turned around sharply. Behind him, Tony saw a huge snake that was about to attack him. The strange man in traditional attire was not at all surprised. On the contrary, he looked animated. The enormous snake did not waste any time and immediately attacked our hero. The guy barely managed to dodge at the last moment, and his chest fell, opened, and the blades scattered. The notification in front of the hero's eyes indicated that he was being attacked by a D-level python. Tony attempted to escape, but was stopped by an artificial barrier that was impossible to overcome due to his lack of B-rank power. Meanwhile, the huge snake continued to attack our hero, ignoring his attempts to escape. In addition to physical attacks, the snake emitted a poisonous mist from its throat. Tony was only able to avoid defeat thanks to the protective function of his gloves, which he had received as a reward earlier. Thanks to the fact that the protection was activated, the guy realized that he was real. Only now did he realize that all this was not an illusion, but a real battle. So the guy tried to avoid as many injuries as possible, constantly dodging. The strange man knew that they were actually now in a magical trap, which was located tens of miles from the school. Therefore, the monster was also real, and one had to either fight it or die. The man wondered how long this guy could last in battle. For a while, Tony tried to dodge, but quickly realized that he needed to go on the offensive. The guy tried to use his well-practiced blow and attacked the snake. However, her skin was so strong that he couldn't even pierce it. Instead, Tony had to retreat again and take a few steps back. The guy looked closely at his hand and noticed that his trained fist was covered in blood. This snake had good defensive armor, so he needed a weapon. Suddenly, the guy remembered that he had recently been given new blades. Tony decided to take advantage of them and immediately rushed back to the box that was lying on the ground. The hero instantly grabbed the first blade he came across in his hand and prepared to attack. He understood that he wouldn't be able to escape from this place, but he could try. After which, the guy pushed off the ground and tried to thrust the blade into the snake's body. He tried to break through the monster's scales again and again, but he couldn't do it. The man watching the fight realized that the guy was about F rank or even less, so he didn't understand at all why this weak guy had attracted the attention of their commander. Tony still couldn't break through the monster's scales, but he noticed that he was developing again in a real fight. At first he was scared, now he doesn't want to fight with this giant. If he continues and uses his perception, he will be able to find out her weaknesses. The guy concentrated and saw the snake's weak spot, attacking right at it. This time he managed to break through the scales, but it was not enough. The snake only became even more angry and began to attack our hero with greater zeal. Suddenly, that same strange man intervened in the schoolboy's fight and stopped him. He ordered the boy to pay attention to the monster behind them. It took the man a few seconds to deal with the monster and remove the barrier. As soon as Tony landed on the ground, the environment around him began to return to its original state. The guy immediately realized that the man in front of him was incredibly strong. He was able to defeat the monster Tony was fighting with one precise blow. His gaze fell downwards, and the hero noticed that the blades from the suitcase were scattered in a chaotic manner. Because of his illness, the hero immediately rushed to straighten them so that they lay flat. At this time, a man came closer and introduced himself as the director of the personnel department of the Fang family's training squad, named Fang Dong. The man looked at the boy's stunned face and thought that he had managed to impress him. However, in reality, the matter was in the unusual illness of our hero. In his opinion, the man's previous blow, which killed the monster, was truly perfect. For a guy with OCD, they seemed like the pinnacle of perfection. The hero was impressed by this and wanted to be able to deliver such perfect blows. That was why he wanted to join the Fan family's training squad, to find the ideal model of strength there. Tony just wanted to get rid of this strange system as quickly as possible, but the man didn't know this at all and was surprised. Meanwhile, Lucy was running across the schoolyard looking for her friend, who didn't even say hello to her. The girl saw her friend from afar, who was standing opposite another man. Lucy immediately recognized the director of the Fan, who was a very famous person in the city. She heard her friend and the director agreeing on something for the next day. After the man left, the girl came out from around the corner and turned to her friend. She asked if the guy was really okay if his family was looking for him. Tony replied that he was fine, after which Lucy hugged him tightly. The girl was worried that Tony had suffered some internal injuries because he had run so fast. However, at that moment, the hero only dreamed that the girl would move away from him at least a meter. He hated it when people invaded his personal space. The mere thought of being surrounded by a crowd of people made the guy feel sick. Although Tony noticed that Lucy looked absolutely clean and didn't irritate him as much. The girl promised to protect her friend if others started to bother him. Lucy didn't like it when Tony started lecturing her to be careful. Last time she went to look for a bully, so she could well have gotten into trouble. During their conversation, someone was watching the couple from around the corner and eavesdropping. Tony asked Lucy how she knew about the Fan family because he himself had never heard of it before. A friend told me that the Fan family is one of the 4 top clans that has become a supplier of dungeon resources for the Ministry of Defense. It is a force to be reckoned with, controlling 10% of all the city's resources. Just at this time, the heiress of the Fan family arrived at the administrative building and was getting out of the family car. It was the same Vanessa who had just recently introduced herself to our hero. This time, the girl was dressed more formally and was heading out on business. She entered the building accompanied by one of her bodyguards and headed to the head office. Fang Dong couldn't stop looking at his mistress and how graceful she looked. The girl asked the master how his meeting with Tony went recently. The man noticed that the boy agreed to join them, but his strength was rather useless and not worthy of attention. He tried to offer to introduce the girl to some worthy newcomers, but she rejected him and ordered him to keep an eye on the guy. Vanessa reminded that the master should not allow beginners to be lazy. They should not be thoroughly prepared. Vanessa hoped that things would get a lot more interesting once Tony showed up at their training camp. The master turned to the newcomers and said that the lady was equally interested in everyone, so everything depended on their diligence. He began to command them and told them what to pay special attention to. He also emphasized how beautiful his young mistress's gait was. The man praised Vanessa so much that she heard it and began to worry. Because of this excitement, the girl could not concentrate and accidentally twisted her leg. She was saved from falling by one of the bodyguards who appeared nearby in time. However, even this situation was presented by the master as if the lady was too perfect for this world. On one of the top floors of a high-rise building, a man stood in his office and looked out over the city. It was the head of the family, Fan Dillon, who was waiting for the arrival of his daughter. A few moments later, the door to his office opened and Vanessa herself entered. The man did not understand why his daughter wanted to go to a regular school, being so wealthy. However, the girl noticed that she was not an awakened huntsman, so she was just an ordinary girl. Father remarked that she would become the boss, and the manager should not worry about power. The man has already found those who will support the girl in the future. He heard that his daughter had recently become interested in a particular person and had sent a master to find him. Vanessa said that the master volunteered himself and even sent a monster to test the newcomer. She personally watched as the boy passed the tests and agreed to join the ranks of the Fan family. That is why the girl felt that Tony would be stronger than she seemed at first glance. A few days later, the weekend arrived, and many people gathered at the Fan family's training field. Our hero, Tony, was one of those newcomers who came there for the first time. There were a lot of people around him wearing a variety of clothes. They all had weapons with them that looked very expensive. Tony felt it was best for him to keep his distance, as some of these people looked dangerous. The talk around him was that all the resources in the dungeon were controlled by the 4 major clans, which was why there were so many people wanting to join the ranks. Tony walked forward a little and got his waiting number from one of the administrators, after which everyone who received a serial number was asked to go through a selection process. This is how your rank should be determined, which is fixed, and very few can fully awaken their abilities. Most awakened ones receive the lowest level, of which only 1% are people with abilities of rank D and above. S-rank hunters, some of whom are strong enough to rule an entire country. Here, in reality, their city's army is under the command of a foreigner, the only S-rank hunter in Bonnie City. Gradually, the huge queue diminished, and finally our hero approached the determining device, and he was asked to bring his hands closer so that it could test his strength. A few moments later, the ball announced that our hero was a rank F huntsman and had no employment. Levels below D are considered very weak, so no classes are provided for them. The higher ranks are divided into warriors, mages, archers, assassins, spellcasters, and healers. Tony watched as people around him were happy or sad about their newly acquired rank. However, he still envied even those who received E rank because his was the lowest. Suddenly, the crowd began to shout joyfully, which attracted the attention of our hero. It turned out that one of the new recruits had achieved a D-level rank, which was very rare. It was a young, strong guy in metal armor who was descending the stairs. There were envious people all around him, but Tony was worried about something. And he looked at the information board and thought about how strong he would become if he completed the remaining 99% of the task. Immediately after this, all the new recruits, including the hero, went to the recruit training center. There, they were told that they were all dressed in uniforms and were becoming new recruits for the Fan family. From that moment on, the man promised to become their teacher in the use of various types of weapons. Legend has it that in ancient times there was a unique martial art that could channel internal power. By concentrating it inside the sword, recruits will be able to hit a target several miles away. He added that although those gathered were awakened, their abilities were nothing compared to the legendary power. But along with their abilities, the true power of the awakened lies in how they handle their weapons. Differences in angle, force, and speed can affect the destructive power of an impact. Immediately after these words, the man concentrated and made one quick strike with his sword. It didn't look very strong, but it was strong enough to cut all the tubes several times. The blow was so perfect that it completely impressed our hero. The other recruits gathered there were also amazed by the fencing skill of their master. What was even more surprising was that their teacher was not a fighting type, but a magician. However, what impressed our hero most now was precisely the perfect and precise blows this man delivered. It seemed that he could handle absolutely any weapon that existed in this world. He demonstrated strikes with an axe, a spear, katanas, swords, and other weapons. Absolutely every mastery of the instrument was achieved at an incredible level. After the demonstration, all the newcomers went directly to the hall for weapons training. There, they practiced their skills, but many of them quickly became exhausted. Some of the recruits were of the magical type and saw no point in owning weapons. However, Master Dong heard their words and said that the boys were deeply mistaken in their reasoning. He noticed that without weapons skills, they wouldn't get into even the weakest team, so he sent everyone to train. Although the recruits went on to practice, not all of them did so. Among the newcomers, there was one strange guy who tirelessly practiced the same punch. This was our hero, who was forced by the system to repeat the same blow over and over again. The guy even closed his eyes on purpose so as not to see the notification every minute. He repeated the stance and punched relentlessly until the notification disappeared. The guy was incredibly exhausted, but his illness was stronger than his fatigue. He felt that he was only a short step away from achieving the ideal, so he continued to train. Finally, Tony put all the strength he had left into one of the blows. It was very difficult. After a long training session, the guy's hands were shaking from fatigue. Luckily, it was at this moment that the guy achieved the perfect execution of the stand and was able to improve his level. And the rest of the newcomers watched our hero and did not understand why such a weak guy was practicing his punches so diligently. However then, without much delay, our hero took up a new type of weapon. He only stopped when he reached the maximum level of mastery of a new type of weapon. The last one on the plan was the medieval sword, but the elder one did not show the perfect attack, so the hero had to learn it himself. A week passed, during which each of the recruits had to find a suitable weapon and demonstrate their experience in using it. Most of the newcomers immediately rushed into the fighting hall to demonstrate what they had learned during this time. However, there was one newcomer who had no intention of joining them, but stubbornly worked on primitive movements further. The newbies didn't understand why the guy was wasting his time in the training room when everyone was there to hunt monsters. Most people thought that after awakening, his abilities would not change, so further training was not necessary. So most of them focused on killing monsters and didn't know how to develop their abilities further. Among themselves, the newcomers discussed the same guy who was waving weapons in the training hall, even though he was the weakest among them. People passing by heard talk about how that guy was personally chosen by someone from the Fan family. The guy in the suit was surprised that there were still such strange relatives in their family. Fang Chong thought that Fang Dong was becoming more and more stupid as he got older and was wasting his time. Lately, he's been followed by a new recruit who recently achieved level D and now wants to become famous. The guy knew that Fang Chun was going to marry Vanessa, so he wanted to stay close to him. He bowed to the young man, called him master, and asked him for help. The young heir was pleasantly surprised by such sycophancy and promised to put in a good word for the guy at headquarters. The young berserker was very grateful to his new master and said that he treated him like a father. All this time in the training room, our hero suggested practicing the same final blow. After some time, he brought his mastery of the last type of weapon to the maximum level and stopped. As a reward for this, he received an inner strength skill that increased his stats by 25%. Thanks to this, the boy could use his willpower to inflict greater damage on the target with the weapon he had mastered. This was the very skill his teacher had spoken of, so the hero was eager to try it out in battle. The hero went into the duel room with everyone else and saw for the first time the portal to the combat zone, which looked quite impressive. However, he noticed that the senior mentor did not allow just anyone inside. The portal to the combat zone is intended exclusively for those who have achieved level D and above. Everyone gathered felt it was unfair that they could not use the portal just because of their rank. However, rules are rules, so preference was given to those who were more talented. The main rule of this world was built on the principle that the strongest survives. Awakened high rank can pass to better levels of the dungeon, get more valuable resources. In every group or guild, 90% of the loot always goes to the top and most capable. During this time, the weak can only act as support, covering their backs or while being crushed like ants during guild wars. Therefore, the master advised to blame only fate for one's weakness and take what is given. Tony didn't like the fact that people with low levels were left to accept that they were losers. So our hero stepped forward and said that a person's strength is not determined by rank alone. The master didn't like this, and the guys started arguing among themselves, but they were suddenly interrupted. A hand from one of those who had entered earlier emerged from the huge portal. The guy noticed that they needed help, for which they promised a reward. The guys needed a few volunteers, and our hero volunteered to do so. The awakened one did not ask any more questions and simply asked if anyone else was going to join them. Several people volunteered to help clear the dungeon, after which they went inside the portal. It wasn't a real dungeon, just a simulated D-level dungeon. However, the boss of this dungeon was too strong because he possessed not only combat skills, but also magic. In addition to the strong boss, small demons kept appearing continuously, getting in the way and getting in the way. Berserker's partners tried to persuade him to retreat and not take so many risks. However, the boy remembered that Fang Chong had promised to make him a captain if he completed this mission. That is why the guy did not want to give up and run away, but continued to fight the monster. The boss of this dungeon was too strong even for him, but Berserker had no intention of retreating. The guy used his last strength to repel the monster's attacks and hoped that help would come to them soon. He even sent another man to check where the first one who went for help had gone. Just at this time, our company had just entered the portal and found itself in a dungeon. Tony and the other recruits were inside the simulation for the first time and were impressed by the environment. It was an underground city for combat training that created a deadly aura. The guys needed to hurry to help those who were fighting the main boss. At this time, Berserker could not withstand the onslaught of the huge monster and flew back. During the fight, he had dropped his weapon and was now lying on the ground completely unprotected. But just at that moment, help arrived and the guy was able to breathe a sigh of relief. However, he glanced at his assistants and immediately recognized among them the same weakling who had been endlessly practicing his blows. However, there was nothing to do, so Berserker ordered some of the guys to surround the monster and distract it. He ordered our hero and another weak mage to remain in the cordon and cleanse the lower demons. Our hero's partner looked completely frightened and had absolutely no idea what he should do. Then one of the older recruits shouted at him and said that the guys should attack the monsters in any way available to them. However, Tony noted that these demons do not attack them unless they themselves show hostility. That's why he immediately drew his weapon, which attracted the attention of one of the demons. It was a huge monster in a black cloak who immediately rushed at our hero. However, the guy was waiting for this in order to test his new abilities. It was quite a difficult opponent for a newbie, but it was time to try out the new fencing style he had mastered. The terror that the demon inspired in our hero was different from what he felt when he fought the python for the first time. Now for Tony, this demon was just an ordinary monster and nothing more. So the guy concentrated and delivered his only strong blow to the demon's shoulder. This was the first time the guy used this punch in a fight after intense training. However, the blow was not yet good enough to kill the demon the first time. So Tony continued to fight one demon after another. He struck them and each time tried to improve his skills and increase the damage. The newbie even looked at his partner and his imperturbability thought that the demon was very weak. Therefore, he believed in his own strength and decided to attack his opponent as well. The guy decided to start with one of the simple strikes and attack the demon from behind. However, this did not cause him any harm. It only made him angry and drew attention to the guy. The magician thought that the monsters were too scary, so he was afraid of him. He froze in place and began to tremble with fear at what our hero Tony saw. At the last moment, he managed to put his sword out and protect his partner from the monster's attack. The guy noticed that a monster of this level is actually not as scary as it seems at first glance. While our hero was fighting small demons, the squad leader was confronting the boss. The berserker was worried that during the entire battle, the glow of the enemy's sword did not go out. That's why he decided to summon all his strength and use his signature technique. Out of the 10,000 D-level awakened, he was the only one with this mutation. It allowed him to instantly increase his defense and power during combat. The commander and his assistants decided to attack the boss together, using their secret weapon. Meanwhile, at the other end of the dungeon, our hero was fighting another demon. He didn't like the fact that his partner was sitting uselessly on the ground and doing nothing. He ordered the boy to help him clear the dungeon, but he was too scared. Instead of helping, the boy turned around and ran to the exit of the dungeon to go home. All this happened at the same time as the main attacking team was attacking the boss. The commander did not understand why, after his strengthening, the monster was still not defeated. The guy also noted that due to fatigue, he was moving slower and slower. He even suggested that the monster's sword caused a paralysis effect on its opponent. At this moment, the commander noticed that one of the newcomers was running home. However, he couldn't do anything about it because he himself was paralyzed right in the air. It seemed like this was exactly what the dungeon boss had been waiting for all along. The commander couldn't move even when the monster's sword was rushing at him with all its might. With literally one powerful blow, the boss killed the berserker and made him disappear from the dungeon. In the dungeon, movement is automatically triggered after the subject receives a fatal blow. The subordinates started to run after they saw that the strongest of them had been defeated. The first among them was the very same newcomer who volunteered to come to the rescue. He ran out of the dungeon and faced the disapproving looks of his comrades. Only in the training room the guy was able to breathe calmly and tried to catch his breath from running fast. He raised his head and saw in front of him the commander who had just fought the main boss. Berserker's assistants believed that their defeat was the fault of the newcomer, so they decided to beat him up. The guy tried to justify himself by saying that he was simply afraid of ghosts and did not expect this. The commander saw how his charges protected him, so he believed their words. The guy couldn't admit that he lost because of his weakness, so he ordered the culprit to be beaten. Meanwhile, in the dungeon, our hero was left alone and continued to fight the monsters. He defeated one demon after another, practicing the power of his blows. After some time, he didn't notice that he had cleared out all the lower-level demons. Only then did he notice that only the boss remained in the dungeon, and his partner had disappeared. The guy noticed that the boss's health was significantly reduced. He couldn't watch his partners leave without finishing what they started. So the hero decided to fight the boss on his own to bring the health bar to 0. Thanks to the system, the young man could see all the characteristics of this monster, its weak points. Only now did the guy admit that the system was not entirely useless and often helped him. The first thing he decided to do was to use his signature punch, which he had been practicing before. However, the monster easily blocked his attack and threw the guy back. The hero noted that the most important thing is to not let the monster paralyze his body. Tony saw this battle as a great opportunity to fully master his new ability. He applied the additional features of the protective gloves and rushed into battle. Meanwhile, in the training hall, the newcomers continued to beat up the poor magician. Several guys held him by the arms, and the squad leader hit him in the face and body. The guy sincerely believed that if he hadn't been distracted by this guy, he would have been able to defeat the boss. Some in the crowd tried to object, but their mouths were quickly shut so as not to become next. Despite the fact that there were people with abilities among the crowd, none of them dared to stop the commander and confront the strong. This went on for some time until the silence in the training room was suddenly interrupted by someone's loud scream. Everyone present turned their attention to the place from which it came. It was our hero who emerged from the portal and accused the commander of taking advantage of his position. Our hero ordered the captain to blame only himself for his failures. The newcomers were surprised that such a weakling would allow himself to insult one of the strongest. After our hero's words, the berserker became furious and dropped his victim. The young magician was already unconscious and fell like a stone onto the cold floor. At this time, Berserker and his assistants were very angry and demanded that the guy repeat his accusations. The hero was not one to be scared and happily repeated that he considered the commander a coward once again. After all, recently he was left completely alone in the dungeon and fought against the boss. Despite his fatigue and exhaustion, our hero struck the monster again and again. The boss was so strong that it completely dispelled the protective power of his gloves. The hero knew that the enemy's sword had a paralyzing effect that he would not be able to resist. That's why he had to time the final blow precisely and deliver it. However, the guy did not despair and tried to attack the monster with all his might. This was paying off because his health bar was gradually decreasing. The hero was glad that his plan was working, so he tried even harder. He tried to combine different types of attacks to make it harder for the monster to defend against them. During the fight, Tony clearly remembered the movement that his teacher performed. With each blow, the guy pumped up his skills more and more and increased his strength. After some time of their fight, the boss's health was almost at 0. This time, the young man decided to use the blow that the master delivered with an axe. He brought it down right on the monster's head, hoping to cause more damage. The guy was overjoyed to see that the boss's health bar was completely empty. However, instead of his long-awaited victory, something unexpected happened. Another monster burst out of the monster's body, which looked like a huge demon. This demon seemed to swallow our hero inside itself and poisoned him. After this, Tony immediately felt incredible pain that made him go numb. The guy remembered that internal strength skills had special conditions for activation. In order to use inner strength, a person must be on the brink of death. Our hero's body was in a terrible state. The system was sounding the alarm. After a few moments, she announced that the conditions for activating the internal force had been met. Immediately after this, the hero's attack power, defensive power were increased, and his health was fully restored. Thanks to the removal of the negative effect, Tony was able to free himself from his captivity. The guy used one of his practiced punches to break out of the cage. Using his internal energy and his blade, he seemed to cut the demon in half. Having done this, the guy landed on the ground and waited for the next attack. However, instead, a huge magic crystal landed next to him. The system announced that this was a reward for defeating the Ghost General, which gave additional skills. It allowed one to learn the skill of the afterlife swordsmanship that the boss possessed. Our hero decided to appropriate this skill, so he clenched his hand and broke the crystal to activate it. Immediately after that, a glowing aura surrounded him, which gradually fed into his body. Then inscriptions in a language unknown to him appeared around the hero, which gradually disappeared. Immediately after this, the hero opened the skills window to check what he had achieved thanks to this victory. The boy was disappointed that after all these tests, he had only advanced his beginner's fencing skills by 10%. That's why he was so angry and decided to provoke the escaped commander. The berserker couldn't stand such humiliation, so he rushed to attack the newcomer. However, our hero easily dodged all of his blows, making the guy look like a fool. This only further angered the commander, who became more accurate in his strikes. At some point, Tony became so bold that he decided to block him. The guy easily stopped the commander's fist and squeezed it so hard that it caused him pain. Berserker didn't understand why this newbie had such enormous power. Immediately after this, the guys went their separate ways and decided to attack each other. Berserker didn't want to show his weakness and fear, so he decided not to retreat during this fight. However, they were suddenly distracted by someone's ringing voice, which rang out throughout the entire training hall. The guys who had been fighting each other before suddenly froze and looked around. It was Vanessa, accompanied by her bodyguards, who came and asked who gave them permission to have a showdown here. In fact, some time ago, the fan family's employees were monitoring what was happening through surveillance cameras. One of the guys noticed how a weak newbie defeated the dungeon boss. However, he pretended that nothing had happened so that his colleagues would not see it. The guy thought that there was some kind of error in the data because the newbie couldn't handle the Ghost General. That's why the guy decided to delete and restart the program so that no one would know about it. However, no one noticed that the dungeon behind the fighters suddenly closed because everyone was busy. Vanessa asked if the boys knew what consequences there would be for fighting in the recruit training area. However, the senior master decided to intervene in the conversation and asked what the girl was doing here. The recruits were very impressed by their mistress's incredible appearance. The girl couldn't believe that the newcomers decided to start a fight right in front of their boss. She noticed the beaten guy and asked what happened here. The master tried to make it look like the guy was too weak and got hurt during training. That is why the girl ordered one of her bodyguards to examine the young man. She also ordered the doctors from among the newcomers to provide first aid to the boy. The girl didn't believe that the guy could get such injuries in a dungeon simulator. The magician wanted to thank his mistress, but the healer ordered him to remain silent. After some time, the bodyguard returned and told the girl what really happened. Vanessa was disappointed that the senior master dared to lie to her face. The girl believed that she was responsible for the actions of the newcomers who belonged to the fan family. She was shocked that the strong awakened dared to poison the weaker ones. She also scolded everyone who had gathered for watching and not trying to help their comrade. Vanessa was angry that after such actions, people would not be able to trust their comrades in the future. It was because of this that Vanessa decided to exclude Berserker from the training group. The squad leader could not believe that he would be expelled from the squad because of this incident. The senior master tried to protect the boy because he was one of the best students among all the newcomers. However, the girl noticed that the master had no right to stand up for the boy because he allowed the students to fight and lied. Immediately after this, the bodyguards grabbed the two expelled men and dragged them towards the exit. Vanessa felt she had done a good job as the future head of the family. The newcomers were impressed by how majestic, noble, and beautiful their heiress was. Suddenly, the girl turned her attention to our hero, who also took part in the fight. She approached the guy and asked if he remembered their meeting near the university. However, Tony looked so scared that he couldn't say anything. The girl believed that he was behaving this way because of his inappropriate behavior in the past. She hoped that the guy would bow down to her as an apology for that incident. However, this hero called her clothes disgusting and asked her not to come so close to him. These words pierced the girl to the very heart and greatly surprised the others. Vanessa got angry after her boyfriend said that her shirt was not symmetrical and was different colors. The bodyguards noticed that their mistress was angry every time she met this guy. Suddenly, another guy who had not been there before intervened in the conversation between these two. Fang Chong brought Berserker back and told him not to throw him out just because of a fight. The newcomers were surprised that this guy could talk so freely with the heiress. Vanessa noticed that the squad leader was bullying the others, so she can't let him stay. However, Chun said that he accepted this guy into his team and would now personally take on his education. He put his hand on the girl's shoulder and asked her to let him deal with it himself. Vanessa felt uncomfortable, so she pushed his hand off her shoulder. The guy suggested that the victim take revenge on his offender and beat him up in return. Immediately after this, he turned his attention to the little guy who had been sitting on the floor all this time. However, he began to refuse, knowing full well that he would get into trouble for this in the future. Tony realized that this was a good move, because no one would dare to hit the commander and the matter would have to be hushed up. This is what happened because Fan Chun proposed to consider the conflict settled. However, our hero was not satisfied with this, so he volunteered to hit instead of the victim. The commander reminded that our hero is the guy who was personally chosen by Master Fan Dong. Chun noted that this was wrong because the commander did not touch him. However, Tony responded that he simply wanted to end their battle and determine the winner. He suggested that the loser leave the training camp, which caused concern in Vanessa. The guy still couldn't look at his boss because her appearance irritated him. Fan Chong watched their interaction and began to get extremely angry at how close they seemed. That's why he allowed the fight to continue and ordered Berserker to hit with all his might. The battle of the newcomers began, and all the spectators were amazed that our hero was not inferior to anyone in strength. The commander and Tony continued to attack each other with equal force. Berserker was annoyed that this upstart newbie was so strong. He was extremely angry that the hero had forced him to take extreme measures. Immediately after this, the guy called upon his power and decided to use a special attack. She allowed him to move several times faster, but it was not enough. Even his increased strength did not help the guy overcome our hero. Tony successfully avoided all of his attacks and still remained upright on his feet. The guy looked at his opponent and realized that he was going to kill him. In this case, Tony decided to try out his new ability on the enemy. Thanks to her, he could increase his strength and also inflict a paralyzing effect on the enemy. With literally one powerful blow, Tony cut his opponent's sword into several pieces. This shocked Berserker so much that he literally fell to his knees. The guy was shocked that some weak newbie was able to break his weapon. All the spectators were impressed by the abilities of this very newcomer. However, Fang Chun noticed that our hero used a special afterlife swordsmanship art, which was very strange. But the guy still admitted his protege's defeat and promised to exclude him from the squad. Immediately after this, he suggested that the newcomer take the test again to rule out any error. Tony was against it because he didn't care at all about his level. However, Vanessa convinced the guy that this would only benefit him. Fan Chun promised to enroll the hero in his sabotage squad if he was right. After some time, Tony was again lying on the table and undergoing examination. Only now it was carried out on a more precise device, which was used by the elders in the family. Fan Chun and Vanessa waited for the results that the researcher would tell them. The girl said that the guy was indeed of the lowest rank, and the equipment was in perfect working order. After these words, Fang Chong was sure that the hero was not able to defeat the Ghost General. Tony immediately realized that the machine was unable to assess his strength because of the system. Fang Chun speculated that Vanessa had deliberately changed the boss's parameters to help her protege win. So he suggested that the hero join the reconnaissance group and go into the dungeon. Today, the guy went through a simulation on the simulator. Now he was offered to visit a real dungeon. Vanessa tried to stop her friend because it was too dangerous. Tony hoped that in a real dungeon he would be able to level up his skills faster. That's why he agreed and was about to greet his new boss. However, he noticed that before shaking hands, Fang Chong stopped and pulled his glove onto his hand. Only after this did he shake our hero's hand with his gloved hand. The heir warned that the dungeon could be very dangerous and they would face difficulties. The dungeon was connected to another world from which monsters constantly emerged. The awakened killed these monsters to obtain crystals that gave them enormous power. Over the past few decades, new dungeons have been appearing all over the world. In order to gain control over a decent number of dungeons, the 4 main families gathered into special groups consisting of carefully selected people. In front of one of these portals, there was a group that belonged to the Fan family. Sabotage Squad number 18 consisted of 4 people who were waiting for their new recruit. After a while, their boss Fan Chun appeared, leading the new recruit. The boys knew that they would have a new addition to their squad, but they saw it for the first time now. Fang Chong introduced the F-rank newcomer and asked him to take care of him. Immediately after this, the guys from the squad hurried to go inside the dungeon. The squad captain was a C rank, and next to him was a D rank LAN healer. The remaining 2 awakened D ranks were also unhappy that they were given such a weak partner. The guys were afraid that in the dungeon they would have to spend a lot of time defending it. But the newcomer stepped into the portal of a real dungeon with them and froze in surprise. It was his first time seeing a real dungeon, so he was impressed by its size and appearance. The system informed the hero that he was in a level C dungeon inhabited by worms. The guy hoped that the worms would look symmetrical enough that it wouldn't hurt to look at them. The squad leader ordered the newcomer not to look around, but to concentrate on the task at hand. The guys went deep into the dungeon, gradually clearing all the passages. It was immediately obvious that they had been working together for quite a long time and in a well-coordinated manner. The healer immediately increased the health of all her comrades, after which they fought the monsters. In each of the tunnels, the boys were met with different types of worms, which they successfully killed. Tony thought that the healer accidentally forgot to apply the enhancement only to him. However, he did not want to deal with this moment and rushed to help his comrades. Each of the squad had good fighting skills and could fight monsters on their own. Sometimes there were too many monsters and dangerous situations arose. However, at such moments, the guys helped each other and covered each other's backs. The squad leader was surprised that the newcomer was not afraid of the first dungeon. The guy noticed that our hero was quite strong for a person with the weakest rank. The medic observed the situation and realized that this guy would be quite difficult to eliminate. Thanks to her abilities, the girl could control monsters for a short period of time and manage them at will. Now she used her spell on one of the monsters and forced it to submit to her will. She came up with a great idea to cause a little accident in the dungeon. Lan watched as our hero fought another worm. It was a pretty strong monster, so it wasn't that easy for the heroes to deal with it. The monster's scales were so thick that the boy's sword quickly got stuck in them. Suddenly, the hero felt a special danger coming from behind. It seemed as if the rest of the squad had been waiting for this moment and watching him. Suddenly, the monster rushed to attack its fellow with whom Tony was fighting. If the guy hadn't managed to jump back at the last moment, he could have easily ended up in that worm's place. Immediately after this, all the monsters went crazy and began to purposefully attack our hero. One of them grabbed him by the clothes, and at that moment, the second one crashed into him from behind. The team members were happy that the newbie was killed by a monster, so they wouldn't be blamed for anything. However, the healer suddenly noticed something strange in the middle of the battle. The hero used his invulnerability ability and easily stopped both monsters with his bare hands. Immediately after that, he used the skills of the afterlife sword art and created a whirlwind that spun the monsters and threw them into the air. After this, the hero delivered one precise and powerful blow, cutting the opponents in half. Thus, his battle ended and the progress of the task reached 15%. The hero didn't notice anything strange and asked if his partners had finished. Tony was surprised that in this dungeon the monsters dissolve after they die. After this, the guy suggested that his comrades move on and let them go ahead. The commander knew the way, so he went first in the middle of the group. Tony noticed that all the monsters were coming out of the nearby tunnel and suggested going there. However, the commander noticed that there were only weak monsters in that dungeon, and they needed a boss. The hero felt uneasy if they couldn't clear the dungeon completely, so he suggested going there on their own. The healer assumed that the hero noticed her attack and decided to check. In this case, the commander sent the girl after the newcomer so that she would follow him and, if possible, kill him. Lon hurried after our hero Tony and said that she would go with him. She was a magician, so she could heal the hero's wounds and help him from a distance. The guy was worried that others might need her help, but the girl reassured him. After this, the commander suggested that the remaining ones fight the boss and not delay the payment of their reward. The deeper the hero went into the tunnel, the darker and gloomier everything around became. However, his partner was able to take care of this and illuminated everything around with her magic. Now our hero could see the monsters they had to fight. They turned out to be huge cannibal ants that hunted in packs. Tony ordered the healer to illuminate everything around him, and he himself rushed into battle. He used the fastest and most accurate strikes to defeat monsters. He attacked each ant one by one, trying to completely clear the tunnel. The C-rank dungeon looked too weak after training in the D-rank dungeon. The healer watched as the lowest-ranking newcomer easily defeated the monsters. After some time, Tony killed all the ants and completed the task at 30%. It happened so quickly that the doe did not have time to come up with a reason to turn off the light in the tunnel. Therefore, the girl was forced to continue to accompany the newcomer and help him along the way. Suddenly, Tony thought that small creatures could be hiding in the extensions and stuck his hand in there. He asked the girl to help him look around, which made her even more suspicious. So gradually, they moved further and further, clearing the dungeon by 60%. Half an hour later, they emerged on the opposite side of the tunnel and reached the cliff. Tony only completed 60% of the quest, so he thought there should have been more monsters in this place. At that moment, a great idea came to the doctor's mind about how she could get rid of her partner. The girl quietly approached him and suddenly pushed him in the back. Tony didn't expect such betrayal from his new partner at all. The girl asked to blame not her, but their master, whom the hero had upset earlier. The doe believed that the guy would not survive after falling into such a deep hole, so she calmly went back to her partners. However, our hero was not so weak and managed to stick his sword into the crevice during the fall. He was angry at Fan Chong, who ordered his men to kill him. The guy fell quite deep, so he couldn't see anything around him. He needed to get out when suddenly the hero noticed a strange light below. He decided to go down a little lower and began to gradually descend with the help of his sword. After some time, the guy almost reached the cave and saw strange water. The hero carefully jumped down and decided to look around. However, he quickly found out that he was not alone in this cave. The boy looked back and saw a strange monster that came out of the shadows. They turned out to be huge butterflies that were hostile to him. The system warned about the toxicity of these insects and their abilities. The guy decided to listen to these clues and activated his inner power. He used one of the skills he had recently acquired. Thanks to this, the hero was able to avoid the toxic effects of the butterflies and attack them. Thanks to his mastery of his sword, the boy was able to defeat these monsters quite quickly. Immediately after that, he completed the task by 70%. At the same second, a notification came that the dungeon boss had been defeated, and the task was 99% complete. Tony assumed that his partners had been too inattentive and had missed some kind of monster. Meanwhile, at the other end of the dungeon, the main squad was fighting the boss. They were only able to kill him with their combined efforts and take a rest. The commander ordered to collect all the magic crystals and move towards the exit. The teammates were disappointed with how low the reward was for winning and clearing this dungeon. After collecting the materials, the partners moved back to the beginning of the cave and met with their healer. The commander praised the girl for killing the rookie and completing the special assignment of their superior. And at this time, the still-living hero was thinking that he had managed to miss some monster. He diligently searched the entire dungeon but was unable to find the last monster. Suddenly, something shiny caught his eye in the middle of the pile of stones. The guy guessed that there was something under these stones, so he began to clear away the rubble. One of the corners of the altar had failed, so it was not symmetrical. The hero became interested in whether it could be repaired using the pieces that were lying nearby. Because of his illness, the hero could not stop, so he completely put the altar in order. However, our guy was also confused by the fact that the golden tray was not in the center of the altar. Tony decided to fix this right away and carefully moved it right to the center. After this, the guy could breathe a sigh of relief and noticed that the altar looked much better. Suddenly, the system announced that the conditions for opening the secret dungeon had been met. At the bottom of the cave, a huge whirlpool appeared in the water. Then the water disappeared and a secret passage opened up, beckoning our hero. Tony moved closer and carefully approached the edge of the hole. The guy looked down and hoped that the remaining 1% of monsters were waiting for him there. He gathered his thoughts and jumped inside this rift to complete the task. There, Tony met a terrifying D-rank spider queen who could shoot venom. The hero was very surprised to meet a D-rank monster in the dungeon. However, he didn't have much time to think, as the spider immediately began to attack him. Tony barely managed to dodge the web that was about to be thrown at him. Tony noticed that the monster had slow attacks, so he had a chance to win. However, quite unexpectedly, one of the monster's attacks changed its trajectory. She turned and rushed straight towards Tony, her net spread wide. The hero did not expect an attack from behind at all, so he fell into this trap. During resistance, the nets began to emit a poisonous gas that caused pain. The more the guy resisted, the more damage he took. At this time, the spider pulled her web and dragged the guy along the ground. She opened her mouth and released a stream of poisonous steam straight towards him. The system immediately notified the hero that poison had been detected in his body. It was so strong that it instantly worsened the health of our hero. At some point, the guy even suggested that he would die in this dungeon, because with every second his strength left his body and he could no longer resist. Due to the neurotoxin, the hero's body entered a semi-conscious state, and the degree of poisoning increased. Sometimes the hero would briefly come to his senses and be surprised that he was still alive. He watched as Spider dragged him across the ground to her lair. The guy noticed that there were 1,000 hungry eyes burning on the ceiling and walls around him. These were weaker monsters who were waiting for the return of their mistress. The guy guessed that the spider wanted to feed him to her children. At that moment, I remembered a conversation with my friend that took place some time ago. Even then, Lucy told him that if he encounters a poisonous substance somewhere, it means there is always an antidote nearby. If someone is poisonous, then only someone who has resistance to this poison can live next to them. That is why the hero, with all his might, launched an analysis of the environment for the presence of an antidote. The poisoning progress was almost complete when suddenly the system stumbled upon something interesting. It turned out to be ginseng, which had detoxifying properties. After collecting the grass, the hero noticed that the process of his poisoning immediately stopped. However, he did not want to reduce the effect of the poison even a little, so he immediately threw away the plant. Because of his illness, the hero wanted the poisoning scale to reach 100%. That's why he put the antidote aside and waited while the numbers changed one after another. After some time, the spider dragged him into the very depths of her lair and stopped. She gave her children an order, so many spiders went towards their prey. The poisoning progress reached 100%, after which the system began to analyze the poison. After this, the hero received permanent resistance to this type of poison, and all his powers were restored. Tony immediately abruptly picked off the ginseng leaves that were next to him. The guy crushed them in his hand to speed up the detoxification process. Then after that, the guy got to his feet and grabbed his favorite weapon. He began to kill the small spiders one by one to completely clear the dungeon. This enraged the spider, who watched the death of her children. The monster couldn't come to terms with this, so she immediately began to attack our hero. However, Tony knew exactly who he was fighting, so he avoided all of her attacks. Only now the guy didn't just dodge, but immediately stopped attempts to tie him up. He knew that when fighting such huge monsters, he could reduce the reach of their attacks by fighting at close range. That's why the guy tried to get as close to the monster as possible. The spider roared in rage because she couldn't kill this guy. Tony moved closer and closer to the monster, avoiding its attacks, and thought about his next step. He remembered that the place where the web is stored is always the most vulnerable for insects. This was the spider's most vulnerable spot, so Tony cut her body. Immediately after this, the guy ran a little to the side and began to observe the monster's reaction. The spider roared from unbearable pain and became even more furious. She used her web-slinging ability to try to patch herself up. The monster decided to attack our hero from above, so it climbed up to the ceiling of the cave. She released another portion of extremely poisonous mucus towards the hero. However, this time our Tony easily managed to avoid a direct hit. He also rushed towards the ginseng thickets that were around him. The guy picked a little of the plant and kept it in his fist for future use. Unfortunately, the hero got distracted and didn't notice how one of the small spiders bit him on the leg. Because of the boss fight, he completely forgot about her 1,000 little children. Seeing this attitude towards her cubs, the spider became even more furious. Out of anger, the monster went into its berserker form and became even stronger. This was the first time Tony had fought a monster that had several different forms. Now the spider could attack much faster, and her strength was also increased. However, the sequence of her attacks itself hardly changed, so it didn't bother Tony much. The guy tried to attack the monster with his internal energy again, but his attacks bounced off. His strongest skill didn't work, so the hero had to dodge again. Eventually, he found himself surrounded on all sides and could move no further. Only now did Tony realize that the monster had thought this moment through from the very beginning. For the first time in his life, he encountered a truly intelligent monster. Our hero was extremely upset that he didn't think to cut the web right away. Now, if he starts cutting it up mindlessly, things will definitely get even worse. The spider was incredibly happy that she had managed to lure this man into her web. Now she could try to kill him as quickly as possible and avenge her children. The monster spat out another whole bunch of slime in the direction of our hero, Tony. However, the guy expected this scenario and used the plant. After destroying the sprouts, the hero received approximately 30 seconds of resistance to any poison. He decided to take advantage of this time and tried to attack the spider. The monster resisted, and the hero had to use his inner strength skills to cut through her web. He followed through with his attack and plunged his sword straight into the monster's unarmored belly. He twisted his sword and released a stream of internal energy, directing it towards the enemy. This was enough to cause irreparable damage to the monster. Gradually, the web began to sag and break, and the monster fell apart. Immediately after this, Tony landed gently on the ground and watched as the monster disappeared. Then the hero looked around and saw small spiders begging him for mercy. However, the guy came to the dungeon precisely to destroy every single monster. After the fight, Tony was happy that the real fight had greatly improved his skills. Suddenly, the system announced that it had received a hidden reward, which was a piece of a puzzle. It was one small piece of a puzzle shaped like a jigsaw puzzle. Tony didn't want to deal with collecting the fragments, so he threw it back over his shoulder. However, suddenly, the puzzle unfolded on its own and entered the system. Tony noticed that an image of the entire painting appeared in front of him. The guy was angry because the system was constantly making his life more difficult with new tasks. He was extremely irritated by his illness and screamed with rage. Energy fluctuations have appeared in portals all over the world, triggered by the appearance of a fragment of the god's bone. The most powerful worlds all felt that something was about to happen. Fang Chun listened to his group's report on how they went into the dungeon. The doctor assured that they had clearly completed the special task they had been given. The boss was pleased and promised that a big reward awaited the girl. He approached her and said that he could do absolutely anything she asked. The girl was embarrassed by his behavior and said that she would be glad of any reward that the master offered her. The rest of the team preferred to pretend not to notice the strange communication. Fan Chun ordered the boys to leave the bill so that he could transfer their reward to them later. He also ordered them to pretend to be unhappy about the loss of their partner when they were around other people. Immediately after this, the squad went to the evaluation hall to hand over the found artifacts. The team laid out all the materials they had obtained in front of the appraiser and waited for the final sum to be announced. The commission's information stated that the team consisted of 5 people, so the girl inquired about the presence of a 5th. The team began to cry over the fact that they had lost their weakest partner in battle. The evaluator was confused by the fact that people expressed their emotions so strongly, although this happens almost every day. She was about to name the final amount to the team when suddenly someone else appeared. It was our hero, Tony, who said he had a few more crystals. Everyone on the team was terribly surprised by his appearance, especially the doctor. The guy immediately realized that he had already been exposed as a dead man in front of the appraiser. The girl didn't care what was going on inside the group, so she ordered everyone to be quiet. Immediately after that, Tony came closer and poured out some crystals from his bag. This was made possible by a special ring that allowed for the storage of countless items. The girl was amazed that this one guy had carried more crystals than the entire previous group combined. At this time, a meeting was taking place in the Fan family's conference room. It was finished, so the secretary bowed to the boss and announced the end. However, the man asked to tell the girl that an abnormally high revenue had been recorded today. Fan Chun jumped up when he heard that they were talking about the very dungeon that Tony had gone to. It was announced that one newcomer had single-handedly brought in 500,000 worth of magic crystals. The head of the Fan family was surprised that his successor reacted so strangely to this name. The guys decided not to show their cards for now and pretended that nothing had happened. One of the masters noted that Tony was one of the capable newcomers that Vanessa had recruited. The girl explained that he studied with her at the same school and she invited him to a study group. Fang Chun scolded Tony for leaving the team without permission and refusing to obey orders. However, the master stood up for his student, who was very diligent and assiduous in his lessons. Fang Chong was annoyed that some pathetic master dared to contradict him. The secretary noted that the profit was within the normal range. It was a small exception, which ruled out the possibility of robbery. Thus, the head of the family realized that the boy was a gifted person, despite his low rank. In this case, the chief decided to instruct Vanessa to invite this young man to the permanent assault group unit. Fang Chong was annoyed that his group couldn't even complete such a simple task and kill the guy. The head of the family noticed that his successor was behaving strangely and drew the attention of others to this. However, the guy stubbornly denied everything, although he hoped to take revenge on the master. A few days later, our hero was sitting in his classes at the university. The boy didn't understand why everyone around him, even teachers, were paying increased attention to him. This continued all day, even when he was walking home with his girlfriend in the evening. Lucy was worried that her friend had been missing for some time, but he reassured her. The girl even suggested that it was because the guy had joined the Fan family. Tony denied everything, so Lucy decided not to press him and wait until he told her everything himself. The boys were walking down the street when they suddenly heard a scream from one of the alleys. They saw a whole crowd of adults beating up some guy. The young people immediately realized that they were simply making fun of the unfortunate man. Lucy immediately decided not to pass by and stop the beating. The girl shouted that it was unfair for a whole crowd to attack one person. This made the bandit very angry, and he was about to hit the girl. However, he didn't have time to do this because Tony defended his girlfriend first. He ordered everyone to get out, because only cowards would beat up the weak. The young people looked at the guy and immediately recognized him as the famous newcomer. They decided not to mess with the famous guy and just run away. Lucy immediately reached out to the victim and offered to take him to the hospital. However, suddenly the guy jumped up and said that now he had a bodyguard, so he was safe. He continued to shout after the fleeing offenders, while Lucy and Tony stood silently. They realized that the guy was completely fine, so they decided to just leave. When the unfortunate man finished screaming and turned around to thank his rescuers, they were no longer there. The friends went for a walk further around the city, after some time bumping into their new acquaintance. It was the same beaten guy who now organized Tony's fan club. The young man screamed about how Tony saved him and gave his offenders a hard time. The guys passing by laughed at their classmate because Tony was too weak to become his fan. The others agreed with him because the lowest wounds are the weakest among the awakened. Tony was also unhappy with this incident, so he rushed towards the guy. He slammed his hands down on the makeshift counter and broke it. The young man was frightened by the enormous power of his idol and stepped back. Tony couldn't believe that a stranger was trying to recruit people to a group dedicated to him. The hero scolded the stranger for ruining his social life. However, the guy noticed that his heroism yesterday was capable of changing the world. Tony was not happy and ordered the guy to get out and never see him again. Rumors have already spread throughout the university that our hero has his own club. Even Lucy's classmates began to pester her with these stories during her studies. In fact, the girl sincerely believed that this was not such a bad idea. After the awakened ones appeared, not all of them began to use their power for good, so it was dangerous. In the alley, they had already started discussing the fact that a newcomer had appeared at the university and was putting together his own group. They were bandits who intended to rob a man who was dressed quite expensively. The man was scared and promised to pay the hooligans well if they let him go. However, one of the attackers responded that they were not going to steal his money. The second one replied that they just liked to hear the rich people scream when they killed them. The awakened were about to harm a random passerby when someone appeared from above. A stranger in a black cloak jumped from the roof and lowered the boys' heads into the ground. It was a beautiful girl who immediately drew attention to the victim. The girl called herself a guardian, a king who protects ordinary people from hunters. It turned out to be Lucy, who dropped her trademark sign on the ground next to the victim. Tony lay on his bed and couldn't believe what had happened to him recently. Quite unexpectedly, the young man's phone rang, breaking the silence. It was a message from a guy in his group inviting him to go into the dungeon again. The senior master of the Fang family's training center headed towards his car. The man felt that there was someone behind him, but he did not have time to react to it in any way. It turned out to be Fan Dong with a knife in his hand who had come to take revenge for the confrontation at the meeting. The guy easily killed the master and left his trademark next to his body. After some time, a reconnaissance group arrived at the scene, accompanied by a family. Lab technicians revealed that they found a special card next to the victim's body. A few days later, our hero came to the Fan family's assessment center again. He agreed to go underground with the guys again, although he refused for a long time at first. His partners were not happy to see him because the mission's failure had caused them to lose their reward. The team leader recommended that the hero go with the squad into the dungeon. Tony decided to test his abilities and went with them into the portal. A few moments later, all the guys came out of the portal in a completely different place. Immediately after appearing in this world, the system issued a task to destroy all the monsters in the dungeon. Not far from them, the ground began to shake and mounds appeared from under the sand. The squad leader ordered everyone to prepare for an imminent meeting with the monsters. Several mages summoned their power and tried to attack the worms. Thanks to the magic circles, they were able to bind them and make them freeze in place. Then the second part summoned a fire ointment and tried to burn the monsters. Tony was impressed that they were able to clear 20% of the dungeon in such a short period of time. The chief said that his squad would move on, and the supply team should collect more loot. Tony remained standing and watched as the battle mages advanced forward. After a couple of minutes, they had made significant progress in clearing the dungeon. The supply team literally couldn't keep up with them to collect all the crystals. After some time, the battle team reached the monster with the rank. They used their standard set of spells, immobilizing and attacking the monster. Tony was impressed that the mages were able to change the weather and summon lightning at will. A few moments later, a deafening bolt of lightning pierced the monster's body. Immediately after this, the boss was defeated and the dungeon was officially considered cleared. Immediately after this, everyone started discussing how they wanted to get home as soon as possible and rest. However, Tony noted that the dungeon was only 99% cleared. The guy looked down and saw one monster in the form of a huge turtle. He drew his sword and asked permission to kill this monster himself. The squad leader said that the turtle had too much defense even for this rank, and the magic crystals from it were practically worthless. The magicians noted that the monsters had high defense, but they did not attack at all. Tony didn't believe their words about the strength of the turtle, so he decided to check it out for himself. He was impressed that after just a couple of hits, his hands started shaking. The squad leader was pleased with the guy's behavior, but decided to let himself deal with the turtle. Our hero began to attack the monster again and again without causing any harm. After several hours, Tony still had not managed to inflict a single wound on this monster. The hero closed his eyes and tried to think of a tool that could help him. Then Tony decided to try to channel his energy in the form of a chainsaw and chop up the turtle. Tony remembered that he had already seen a similar technique from his master. The guy concentrated hard and then delivered one perfect blow. It was only at this moment that he noticed that he had finally been able to inflict some damage on the monster. Tony was incredibly happy that he finally managed to do it. Thus passed several long hours of endless and weak attempts. During all this time, the hero only managed to deepen the scratch on the monster's skin a little. The young man began to get tired, so he decided to try to change tactics. He rained his perfect blows down on the monster's torso over and over again. In total, during this time, our hero attacked the turtle about 99 times. Now the guy raised his sword above his head and prepared to strike for the 100th time. This perfect blow proved to be shocking and allowed our hero to knock off the monster's head. The monster's body disappeared, and the guy received as a reward from the system the ability to instantly restore his stamina level once a day. Also, thanks to his efforts, he was able to increase his sword skills by a whole level. After Tony received the title of judge from the system, his powers increased many times. In 2 weeks, he managed to complete several level dungeons, after which he became even stronger. However, he was still weak enough for stronger dungeons, so he looked for a new way to train. Dungeons with no rank would periodically appear in the world, and no one wanted to buy them due to the unstable income. Our hero was planning to go to one of these dungeons today. Near the entrance, Michael, with whom the hero began to communicate after that incident, called him over. The guy introduced him to his friend, whom Tony was seeing for the first time. It turned out to be Simon, who had recently completed many solo dungeons and became a star. The guy immediately began to scold our hero for being late and waiting for him. However, Tony noticed that he had arrived here just in time, as he had been told. Michael whispered in his friend's ear that Simon was just very patient. He asked the guy to wait a little while he negotiated entry into the dungeon. Immediately after this, Tony and Simon watched as Michael talked to the guards. The guy showed them that he had received 2 passes to this dungeon. However, one of the guards was confused by the fact that one pass was weaker than the level of the dungeon. In this case, Michael tried to persuade his friend to let them through. The guards had known this guy for a long time and their cooperation was beneficial to them, so they decided to do it. After this, Michael waved his hand and called his friends to join him. After this, a small team went through the portal and found themselves in the dungeon. The reward for clearing this dungeon was initially unknown to the hero. However, the team immediately found themselves in a cave that was surrounded by goblins. Tony immediately noticed that there were too many monsters, so there would be problems. Simon decided to attack first and released a fire ointment from his hands. Our hero was impressed that after one fiery explosion, the dungeon was immediately cleared by 30%. The core team was impressed by Simon's skills, which saved him on more than one occasion. Our hero was also impressed by the skills of his new acquaintance. After this, the guys moved further along the dungeon and entered a new room. It was too dark in there, so Simon snapped his fingers and created a small lantern. Goblins of different sizes immediately began to run towards this light from all sides. Tony turned out to be the fastest, and immediately attacked all the monsters, quickly dealing with them. The rest of the comrades were happy that they had such an excellent defense today. Simon was unhappy that Tony could break the building with his sharp attacks. It was immediately obvious that the boys would be fierce rivals as Michael tried to measure them. The boys continued walking down the corridor when our hero's attention was drawn to cracks in the wall. Tony asked Simon to shine a light and inspect the room, but he didn't want to waste his time. Michael immediately thought that getting these two to work together would be very difficult. Simon allowed Michael to go with Tony to investigate the crevasse. The remaining people followed Simon because they thought he was stronger. Suddenly, their squad was attacked by a huge goblin with a weapon in his hands. However, the guy managed to defeat him with literally one small touch. The guy had no intention of finishing off this monster, leaving it to the others. At this time, our hero Tony was examining the hole in the wall and was going to check it. He moved in his own direction, periodically killing monsters that he encountered along the way. At the same time, Simon and the team moved towards the boss, killing goblins. After some time, the detachment under his command reached the enormous size of the gate. The guy didn't think for long, so he immediately blew up the doors to the room that was unfamiliar to him. A little later, the gray smoke cleared and then a small detachment was able to go inside. Simon looked around and noted that he was in a huge throne room. In front of them, on a pedestal, sat a knight of the same enormous size in armor. Simon tried to attack the monster again with his fire, but something went wrong. The boy encountered armor for the first time that was resistant to fire. In this case, Simon decided to simply increase the temperature of his flame. However, somehow the knight managed to deflect this blow. In this case, Simon decided to try to suppress the monster with the number of his attacks. However, he still somehow managed to block each of them. Simon got a little closer to the monster and decided to attack on his own. The guy tried to use physical force on the knight and then shoot him straight in the eyes. He successfully carried out his plan, causing the flames to penetrate right under the armor. It looked as if a real fire had broken out inside, melting the knight's insides. After this, it seemed to everyone that the monster was defeated and began to disappear. His teammates were pleased with how many materials the boss dropped. Just by this time, Michael and Tony had finished their inspection of the cave and went to join the others. The team headed to the next dungeon, and Simon left the scraps to the two guys. Michael didn't understand why Simon left the monster's huge two-handed sword. The hero system said that the dungeon was 100% cleared. I decided to check on Tony just in case. Suddenly, the monster's sword began to glow green and something appeared from it. The system reported that the cleanup progress was rapidly starting to roll back, decreasing in percentage. The huge sword was completely engulfed in green flames, which gradually formed into a figure. After a few moments, the light went out, and in its place appeared a huge goblin. Tony ordered Michael to step back and took the main battle upon himself. The goblin didn't wait for our heroes to be ready, so he immediately attacked them. Michael barely dodged at the last moment, so he ran away from the battle. But Tony was glad that he would be able to practice on a strong opponent. The guy immediately found the monster's weak spots and rushed straight to his head. With one precise blow, Tony plunged his blade straight into the goblin's throat. After that, he used his blade wind release technique. From a fairly close distance, the monster's head was literally blown off. Tony carefully jumped to the ground and the dead goblin fell down like a stone. However, the hero immediately realized that there was something wrong with this monster. He was proven right when a moment later the headless goblin tried to rise. The monster got to its feet and continued to attack the heroes as if nothing had happened. A few moments later, his head appeared in place again and the monster was reborn. Tony found out that this boss can resurrect, but he has a fragile body and slow movement speed. Our hero was able to easily hit the monster several times in a short time. After the 7th victory, the monster lit up and began to disappear, but that was not the end. Instead of disappearing completely, it only began to gather in one point. Immediately after that, a rank A goblin warrior boss appeared in the place of light. Michael and Tony were amazed that the boss had evolved and become stronger. They had never had to fight such a strong opponent before. The monster was so strong that it could cut through a wall with one light blow. His movement speed and maneuverability have also increased significantly. Tony had to work hard to dodge his lightning-fast attacks. The goblin was able to create 3 cutting blades at once, which made the situation even more difficult. At first, Tony only ran away from the monster's attacks, not knowing how to fight it. At some point, our hero lost his vigilance and hit his back against the wall. The goblin boss was going to take advantage of this situation and attack the guy. However, the monster was suddenly distracted by some strange sounds behind him. It was Michael who was about to use his hidden power. He promised to detain the monster, and during this time, Tony should come up with a plan for victory. Michael's technique was complete, so his body was surrounded by a special aura. The guy started running around and screaming, attracting the monster's attention. Tony was amazed that his friend could use such high-level provocation techniques. The goblin literally went crazy chasing the guy, although Tony had killed him several times before. However, the guy decided not to waste time and activated his new judge skill. His perception of an adult is so great that the hero was able to see movement even with his eyes closed. Immediately after this, Tony rushed to attack the monster and tried to attack it from behind. However, the goblin was not so simple, easily stopping the man's attack. Tony ordered his friend to stop using the provocation technique and hide. Michael trusted his friend and hoped that he had some kind of plan. Tony's perception was now much higher, so he could follow the trajectory of the monster's sword. The guy noticed that the goblin was going to use some special technique. Thanks to his perception, he hoped that he would have time to calculate its movement. The goblin warrior used the 5-light/chain technique. Thanks to his abilities, Tony was able to copy the technique in a second and repeat it perfectly. Thus, each of the opponents used the same technique against each other. However, our hero's swordsmanship was much greater than that of the monster. That's why he was able to defeat the boss, receiving a special ability as a reward. On the way to the dungeon, Simon felt unsatisfied and immediately led the team to another abandoned dungeon. This time, the guys found themselves in an area of Arctic permafrost. They were walking across a vast frozen field when something appeared right above their heads. The people looked up and saw a huge bird hovering above them. It turned out to be the A-rank boss, the bird of snow and ice, who ruled this dungeon. The team was happy that with his fire element, Simon would be able to defeat the ice monster with ease. The guy was confident of his victory, so he immediately attacked the boss. He destroyed the rock on which the monster was sitting, but he himself managed to dodge. The hunter was annoyed that this boss was very agile. He tried to win again with the number of his attacks that helped him with the previous one. However, this boss was not as simple as it seemed at first glance. The bird flapped its huge wings and used currents of air to deflect the attacks downwards. The fireballs immediately crashed into the ground, forcing the hunters to maneuver between them. Simon was amazed that this bird had the dual attributes of ice and wind. Then he decided not to waste time on trifles and create a huge flow of fiery energy. At this time, the boss did not waste time and attacked the people with huge blocks of ice. Simon formed a fireball and sent it straight towards the hovering bird. About halfway between them, the fire element collided with the ice element. However, the bird proved stronger and its long spikes rained down on the ground right on Simon's partners. The guy faced such a strong opponent for the first time, so he began to worry a little. He ordered his partners to run away, and he himself promised to cover their backs. However, the boys were unable to do this because the bird blocked their path. Simon ordered the men to spread out and attack the ice curtain with his fire. He cut a small hole in the ice and ordered the people to escape through it. The partners were worried about their commander, but he asked them not to underestimate him. Before the guy could finish speaking, new attacks from the iceberg rained down on him from above. Simon managed to use his fire skills or melt them at the last moment. Meanwhile, Michael and Tony were unaware of what was happening to the rest of the team. The guys came out of the dungeon and took out quite a lot of crystals. Michael wanted to give Tony the bulk of it, but he decided to split it equally. Suddenly, the boys' attention was drawn to something strange to their left. They saw Simon and the rest of the team returning very battered. Michael asked his old friend what terrible thing had happened to them. The others said that they encountered a monster with 2 attributes of ice and wind. Simon was unhappy that people continued to discuss his failure and escape. The guy asked why Michael and Tony spent so much time in the cave. Then the young man told about the 9 lives of the A-rank boss and about defeating him. Tony laughed at the guy who didn't finish the job because of his patient nature. This made Simon, who already had a bad character, incredibly angry. Tony went home immediately after that, hoping to work in such a dungeon again. Because of his fiery nature, Simon could not refuse the opportunity to compete with the newcomer once again. The boy was worried that his thoughtless actions had put his team in danger, just as his father had warned him. Previously, Tony received an ability that allowed him to restore his physical strength once a day. An announcement came in the general chat that tomorrow there will be a tournament to find new members for the team. So the next day, Tony got ready and went to the Fan Clan arena. There was a whole crowd of people gathered there, watching the ring in the middle of the stage. The host announced that today some people will be able to get a chance to enter high-level dungeons. Of course, our hero couldn't help but take advantage of the opportunity and try his luck with his ability. The host announced that only 8 people out of 112 participants would be able to take advantage of this chance. The crowd simply roared at how exciting the competition promised to be. Tony wasn't entirely confident because he didn't know the other members. Fang Chun was irritated when he saw the interaction between the two. Time passed, and the first competitive fights among the contenders were held in the arena. After each competition, only one of the fighters moved forward. The Awakened possessed various types of abilities, including elemental ones. The next subject was Tony, who spoke on behalf of young Mrs. Vanessa. Now an opponent spoke out against him in the name of Teacher Fan Dong. One of them is a top-notch rookie at the weakest rank, and the other finished 9th last year. This year, the guy hoped to get his coveted place, so he immediately rushed to attack our hero with his strongest technique. However, literally moments later, he was completely disarmed by a single blow from Tony. His physical strength was so great that the guy flew to the opposite end of the ring. In this case, Tony did not use any special techniques, but only used his own strength. The head of the Fan family was impressed by how promising a guy Vanessa had chosen. But Fang Chun was even more irritated by the fact that the girl was able to attract the boss's attention. Round number 2 ended with the same outcome and an easy victory for our hero. By the 3rd round, everyone began to fear their opponent and could not fight properly. Thus, the same 8 candidates were determined. They all lined up and the host invited the crowd to greet them. Tony had no idea that his former teammates would be among them. His former raid partner was also impressed by the skills of the newcomer, whom he had previously underestimated. As a reward, the head of the family will personally present a special prize to the strongest of the 8. After this, a short break was announced, during which Fang Chong conferred with his subordinates. Lan was afraid to act unfairly because the opponent was very strong and everything happened in front of the spectators. However, Fang Chong noticed that he had already applied a weakening poison to the handle of the hero's favorite weapon. One of his subordinates noted that resorting to such methods was too obvious. However, the boss noted that no one would find out anything because he had his own people everywhere. Then the subordinate stopped arguing with him and decided to act according to plan. After the break, all players were invited on stage and had the right to choose any weapon. Tony walked up to the table and looked at each of the blades carefully. They were all too crooked and asymmetrical for him, so the guy decided to use his own powers. Vanessa explained that the hero suffers from obsessive-compulsive disorder, which is why he sometimes behaves strangely. Fang Chong was worried that the hero did not choose the poisoned sword, and the first point of the plan failed. However, he was calm because they had a backup plan just in case. One of his subordinates possessed a special high-level dagger that was capable of absorbing an opponent's stamina. The guy had stealth skills, so he could easily strike at close range. The boss was glad that even though Tony had avoided the first step, he would still lose. The contestants made their choices in the first round, and Tony had to fight against Do. The girl was upset when she saw her opponent using his own sword. The referee was about to announce the start of the fight, but he didn't have time to do so. The girl raised her thin hand up and said that she surrendered without a fight. She explained that she had already made it into the top 8 and was no longer interested in fighting. Tony was surprised by the girl's behavior because he didn't think she would give up. The crowd was unhappy that they would see one less battle. Fan Chong was dissatisfied with the girl because he realized that she did this out of fear. The rest of the fights went without any particular problems, quickly revealing their winner. Thus, our hero and Fan Chong's strong subordinate reached the final. The crowd roared with excitement before such a good match, which they had been waiting for a long time. Even the head of the Fan family was intrigued by this rivalry and eagerly awaited the outcome. Vanessa was completely confident in her protege's victory, so she was not worried. Fang Chong wasn't worried either, hoping that his excellent plan would work. The host counted down and waved, signaling the start of the fight. Lee and Tony immediately jumped up from their seats and began attacking each other. Surprisingly, the hero turned out to be quite a strong opponent for an experienced hunter. The guy decided to use a trick and attack not only with his sword, but also with his body. Tony swung his leg and pushed his opponent to the side with force. Before he could even get to his feet, our hero was already right in front of him again. The guy used the 3 light blades technique, which he spied on one of the bosses in the dungeon. However, his opponent suddenly disappeared and seemed to dissolve into thin air. Vanessa was surprised because she didn't know about this guy's invisibility abilities. Tony stood in the middle of the arena and tried to sense from which side he would be attacked. Only thanks to his strong perception, the guy managed to put the weapon up and protect himself. Even Lee was amazed at how insightful his opponent turned out to be. If Tony hadn't blocked his attack with his sword, his stomach would have been ripped open. The guy even thought that our hero was able to see him through the disguise. In that case, he decided to take the opportunity to test his guess. At first, Tony didn't notice anything, but in moments of danger, he became acutely aware of his enemy. Thanks to this, the guy managed to dodge the enemy's attack. Lee realized that Tony felt a threat to his life emanating from him during the attack. However, he decided to add a little speed to confuse his opponent. In this case, Tony found himself under attack from an invisible opponent who attacked him from all sides. However, the guy had high susceptibility, so he successfully repelled the attacks. Fang Chun was happy that his plan was working perfectly. Tony repelled his opponent's main attacks, but he still managed to injure him. With each new injury, it became increasingly difficult for the guy to keep up with the attacks. At some point, he lost his guard and managed to plunge the dagger straight into Tony's chest. Topa was dismayed that this would be the first time a murder would occur in this arena. Lee was very happy about his quick victory. He especially enjoyed killing people. However, Tony was suspiciously calm and grabbed his opponent by his shirt. He easily got to his feet and hit the guy in the face with his fist as hard as he could. After one strong blow, the opponent lost consciousness and was defeated. Tony used the skill and immediately restored some of his health. The artifact dissipated, after which its abilities were used by our hero. The critical wound in his chest instantly healed, as if it had never been there. The host announced the end of the fight, and that our hero had saved his healing ability for the last resort. The man carefully examined his opponents and announced that he was ready to name the winner. It turned out to be Tony, who was still a complete newbie in the world of hunters. The crowd immediately roared loudly and began to congratulate their new winner. Chief Fan stood up from his seat and personally praised our hero for his victory. Suddenly, the man's attention was drawn to a dagger that was in the arena at that time. The man immediately recognized that it was a special dagger that reduced the enemy's endurance. Therefore, the head of the family immediately guessed that a simple healing would not help our hero. The man admitted that Tony managed to defeat a B-rank hunter with an A-rank weapon. The leader decided to keep his thoughts to himself and went to the arena to congratulate the winner. The man offered Tony a cool sword as a reward for winning. The assistants brought out a special sword, which was considered very rare and powerful in their world. However, Tony greatly surprised the crowd when he refused the sword. Vanessa asked the guy to show respect and accept the gift, but he refused. Fang Chong was angry at such disrespect for the master, but he was stopped by the master. The chief decided to be honest and asked what the guy really wanted as a reward. Tony wanted to completely refuse any gratitude for the victory. However, before he could finish speaking, his entire body was struck by terrible pain. At that very second, the guy lost consciousness and fell to the ground right in front of the people. He came to consciousness and realized that he was in a completely different place. Tony woke up, looked around, and realized that he was in a hospital. A minute later, a nurse came into his room to check his condition. The girl said that the reason the guy lost consciousness was extreme fatigue. She congratulated our hero on his awakening and wanted to call the others. Tony knew he was knocked unconscious for 24 hours due to the side effect of using the skill in the recovery. After some time, the head of the Fan family entered our hero's room. He asked the guy how he was feeling and wished him a speedy recovery. The man noticed that the boy had an incredibly resilient body since he was able to withstand a wound from such a dagger. The man announced that he had a good feeling about the guy and wanted to recruit him. He promised that he would definitely give our hero anything as a reward. The head announced that he had a lot of things to do, so they were about to leave. The man noticed that the heir of Fan Chun was not going to leave the room. The chief noticed that the bloodthirsty dagger was in the hands of his charges, so they needed to talk. Chun didn't dare to confront his boss, so he stood up and wanted to leave. Tony just laughed at the guy acting like that. The receiver did not understand why the head of the family was so unhappy, because he had helped them for many years. The family did not have a son, which is why the boss once installed one. The guy thought that sooner or later he would become the head of the family and marry Vanessa. However, everything changed dramatically since Tony came into his life. The situation had changed, so he needed to contact his family urgently. That same evening, Fan Chun was sitting on the balcony of his family villa and drinking. The interlocutor was hiding from prying eyes, but Chun asked him not to do this. The man agreed and asked how soon he planned to become the head of the Fan family. The guy explained that some problems had arisen and the current head suspected him. The senior master has begun to strengthen his position and plans to hand over all affairs to his daughter. In order to kill the leader, Fang Chun needed the help of his family. Doing it directly was very dangerous, so he needed a backup plan. He wanted Vanessa to be kidnapped and then have a ransom message sent to her. Due to the fact that there are too many ownerless underground cities, the leader will be forced to send all his people to search for his daughter. This way, they can take advantage of the chance to separate the old man from his strongest warriors. And after that, they will be able to lure the leader into a trap and kill him with ease. Vanessa will be their insurance if the leader really is invincible and manages to escape. Even if the old man decided to choose another heir, he would have no options and would be forced to hand everything over to Fang Chun. The man wanted to start carrying out the plan immediately, but Chun asked him not to rush. He already had someone to blame for everything. All he had to do was wait for the right moment. At one of the meetings, the head noticed that their financial reports had been stolen by a feuding family. No one could say anything, but the financial director noticed that it was a mistake. The girl knew that they had been having problems with the Ching family for several months, so she suspected the presence of a spy. The chief agreed with the girl's assumption that there was a spy in their lair. Fan Chun suggested finding the stolen dungeon and identifying the traitor within a certain time frame. The head agreed and said that all the leaks started happening about half a month ago. The director noted that in that case, it was necessary to find out who had come to the family half a month ago. The chief remembered that around the same time, Vanessa brought in newcomer Tony. However, the girl noticed that such a weak guy did not have access to documents. The director asked the girl not to defend her friend, which embarrassed her. The head decided not to allow a quarrel in the council, so he promised to sort everything out. He asked to provide him with information about all the newcomers who had joined them in the last 2 months. After the meeting ended, Vanessa felt depressed and upset. Fan Chun suggested that the girl wait for the results of the investigation first. However, Vanessa didn't like how familiarly he behaved with her. Chun noticed that Tony is always surrounded by girls and his OCD is probably a lie. However, Vanessa knew perfectly well that Lucy was just an old friend of her ward. Fan Chong did not calm down and noted that the girl went to this guy's house too often. Vanessa knew what the guy was doing with his subordinate hunters and advised him to stop judging everyone by himself. After that, Vanessa smiled and went about her business, leaving the guy alone. However, she still decided to discuss this problem with Tony and went straight to his house. Vanessa felt a little awkward about intruding into his personal space, so she took a bodyguard with her. Vanessa still couldn't bring herself to knock on the door, so she just stood in front of it. The girl did not understand why she was hesitating so much, since she had come on a work matter. Suddenly, a very loud and suspicious sound came from behind the door. Vanessa became curious, so she put her ear to the door and listened. The sounds were suspiciously reminiscent of what couples usually do in private. At the same time, Vanessa heard the voices of not only Tony, but also Lucy. At some point, the girl even assumed that Fan Chong had told her the truth. She was very embarrassed, so she started banging loudly on the door and demanding to be let in. Literally a second later, the door opened and a sweaty, beautiful girl appeared on the threshold. They both looked at each other and immediately recognized each other because they had seen each other before at school. Tony emerged from the back of the room wearing only his sweatpants. Vanessa and the bodyguard were taken aback to find the boys in such a situation. Lucy stepped aside a little and invited the girl and the man to go inside the apartment. Vanessa was about to cross the threshold and go in, but our hero stopped her. The guy said that they had just washed all the floors and that we had to walk around without shoes. Vanessa was amazed by his cleanliness, but decided to follow the instructions of the owner of the house. Tony noted that there weren't even any stools in his apartment, so everyone would have to speak standing up. The bodyguard became furious and wanted our hero to allow the lady to sit on his bed. However, due to his illness, Tony was adamant and would not allow anyone to sit on his bed. Vanessa knew very well about this ability of his, so she agreed to stand for a short time. The girl told about the presence of a traitor in the Fan family, so all newcomers will be interrogated. Lucy was unhappy that she only now learned about her friend joining the Fan family. Tony immediately said that he simply didn't want to worry his dear friend. The guy never really wanted to be part of a Fan family, so he would be glad to have the opportunity to escape them. Vanessa noticed that he was her subordinate and therefore could not just leave, which angered Lucy. The girls grabbed the guy by both his hands and began to divide them between themselves. In the end, Vanessa couldn't take it anymore, got angry, and left his apartment. She was very annoyed by Lucy, who was completely in favor of Tony leaving the camp. Suddenly, the bodyguard noticed that there had been no people on the street or around them for a long time. The guy immediately realized that something bad was happening, so he remained on guard. The bodyguard took off his work suit and found himself in a sports uniform. However, before he could say a word, some invisible force suddenly began to influence him. Because of this, the young man was instantly pressed into the asphalt with such force that cracks formed in it. For some time, the guy was still conscious, but he couldn't move anything. Vanessa was worried about her bodyguard and immediately rushed to his aid. However, some invisible voice ordered the girl not to approach the guy so as not to be exposed to the force. Vanessa turned around at the sound of the voice and was immediately sprayed in the eyes with gas from a canister. Immediately after this, the girl lost consciousness and fell right into the arms of the kidnapper. The task was completed. One of the kidnappers ordered the others to take the girl to an abandoned dungeon. The head of the Fan family sat quietly in his office and worked on the computer. Suddenly, his computer screen went striped and showed a playback error. A second later, a pre-recorded video appeared instead of the normal screen. The masked man was in the cave and pointed at the people behind him. They demanded a ransom of 30 billion for the return of the head's beloved daughter. They demanded that she give them the money in a friendly manner, otherwise they threatened to harm the girl herself. The boss got so angry that he punched the computer screen with his fist. He couldn't believe that there were suicides in the world who dared to kidnap his daughter. However, the video recording he saw of the kidnapper's demands was being broadcast on all screens in the building at the time. Information about Vanessa's kidnapping spread instantly among all employees. That is why, after some time, the best hunters of the family were summoned to the training hall. They all came in their fighting uniform and were now greeting each other. The boys calmed down only when they saw the head of the family approaching them. The man announced once again that his beloved daughter Vanessa had been kidnapped, so he ordered everyone to volunteer to make every effort to catch the criminals and save Vanessa. The man knew that the elder doe had the ability to correlate the image with the real location of the shooting. However, the girl admitted that she had already tried, but nothing worked for her. This meant that the girl and the kidnappers were in another world, which angered our leader. The man was horrified by the mere thought that his beloved daughter was in the dungeon. However, the elder doe could not determine exactly who this dungeon belonged to. In that case, Fang Chun suggested using the technique of a massive attack. Send as many people as possible to conduct a total search of every abandoned dungeon. This was the only possible option, so the head decided to do as he was advised. Immediately after this, the company went to the hospital room to see Vanessa's bodyguard. The guy apologized to his boss for failing to protect his daughter. The chief asked the guy to tell everything he remembered about the kidnapping that could help them. He said that everything happened suddenly after Tony left the house. The chief ordered the secretary to check the hunters' bases and find people with suitable abilities. Fan Chun noticed that the kidnapping happened immediately after Tony's visit. The bodyguard explained that Vanessa wanted to personally explain to the guy about the beginning of the investigation to find the traitor. Fan found this suspicious and began to convince the head that the guy was involved in this. That same evening, Lucy sat on the swing and watched the children running along the road. She was upset that Tony ran out of the house after some call and didn't tell her anything at all. Suddenly, 2 adult guys approached the girl looking for Tony. She didn't know anything, but the bodyguards found it very suspicious. The guys asked the girl to go with them to help them. At this time, Vanessa sat surrounded by her captors in the dungeon. The guys were talking among themselves about how they were waiting for the arrival of the head of the Fan family. Vanessa found it suspicious that the kidnapper's target was her father. The girl couldn't do anything, so she decided to gather as much information as possible for now. In fact, she realized that she was in a dungeon in an ice cave. This was the same ownerless permafrost dungeon in which Simon had recently lost. This time, too, Simon called Michael for help and he brought Tony with him. The guy himself didn't know where he was being invited, so he wasn't happy about the meeting either. Simon was determined to prove his superiority by clearing this dungeon. The boys moved through the icy forest until they came across several monsters. They turned out to be huge snow and polar bears that were very aggressive. Simon knew they were no match for him, so he was relatively calm. The guy easily defeated the monsters, causing a huge explosion in the middle of the forest. These loud sounds attracted the attention of Vanessa's kidnappers, who were hiding in a cave. One of the guys decided to go out for a while and check out the situation outside. Meanwhile, Simon burned another polar bear in the middle of a snowy forest. However, he was not very happy because they had a boss fight ahead of them. Tony wanted to check for the remaining monsters, but Simon assured him that he had killed everyone here. Michael asked for a description of the boss so they could formulate a plan of action. Simon remembered that it was an ice bird that had tremendous speed and 2 types of elements. Michael listened carefully to his friend's story and then came up with the perfect plan. He noticed that Tony had a wind element and was using a wind sword. Michael noted that the wind could fan the fire, so the boys needed to work together. Tony appreciated that his friend was so good at improvising in difficult situations. However, they didn't get to chat for long because the dungeon boss was approaching. It was indeed a huge ice bird that hunted strangers. Tony and Simon prepared to attack this huge monster at the same time. First, Simon launched a small amount of fire stream at the monster. However, the bird easily repelled this attack with its elements of ice and wind. Then the next time our Tony and Simon decided to act together. This time the bird failed to extinguish their powerful flames and took damage. Because of this, the monster was extremely irritated and decided to attack the people quickly. The bird formed huge blocks of ice and directed them directly towards our friends. Then the guys decided not to hold back and use their abilities to their full potential. Tony tried to summon the most powerful wind technology he could. The boys combined their efforts and simultaneously created huge fire whirlwinds. Not only did he melt the ice blocks, but he also absorbed the ice bird within himself. There was a huge explosion in the sky, which was seen by one of the kidnappers. The guy realized that these people did not come because of Vanessa, they were simply protecting the dungeon. The guys were very happy when they were able to defeat the boss and were already heading towards the exit. Suddenly, Tony's attention was drawn to something strange near them. The guy saw human footprints in the snow and asked if people lived in this cave. At this time, one of the kidnappers returned back to the cave and began to answer his partner's questions. He explained that the hunters were simply clearing the dungeon and should have left by now. Vanessa was upset that it was not her beloved father. Meanwhile, outside, Simon noticed the words Tony had said to him. The guy pointed to human footprints that went deep into the forest. Michael noticed that these were definitely male footprints, a large size 44. They were especially interested at that moment in where exactly these tracks were heading. The boys thought they had missed the humanoid monsters in the dungeon, so they decided to follow the tracks and find out who they belonged to. Meanwhile, Vanessa's bodyguards brought Lucy to the head of the Fan family himself. The man knew that this was Tony's hero's girlfriend, so he tried to interrogate her. However, the girl honestly said that she had no idea where her friend had gone. The bodyguards did not understand why the girl continued to openly lie and hide this information. Lucy tried to convince those gathered of her honesty and Tony's innocence. However, Dylan was unhappy with this and believed that the girl was an accomplice. However, their conversation was suddenly interrupted by Fan Chun, who burst into the office with news. He announced that while watching the video, intelligence agents found one clue. In some places, melted snow was visible on the video, and steam was coming out of the mouth during the conversation. The chief immediately ordered his secretary to check the cold dungeons that were nearby. However, Fang Chong said that among the unclaimed dungeons there was only one suitable one. Then the chief ordered to convey to all search groups that they should head to this very place. The head himself put on his jacket and went ahead of them in search of his daughter. Fan Chun ran after him, and Lucy remained standing in the middle of the room. At the last moment, the chief ordered the bodyguards to follow the girl and not let her out anywhere. At this time, our company of heroes watched the entrance to the ice cave. The boys wanted to explore it, but Michael was too cautious. He believed that people in the dungeon might behave inappropriately, so it was better to observe them first. However, Simon and Tony were too confident in their abilities and did not wait for anyone. Michael was disappointed with his friend's behavior, but he couldn't do anything about it. After this, the three of them stood up and headed deeper into the ice cave. Tony walked ahead of everyone and looked around the cave carefully so as not to miss anyone. One of the kidnappers suddenly heard someone's voice in the cave and became wary. The boys hoped that it was the head of the Fan family who came to save his daughter. The kidnappers used their invisibility skills and disappeared from sight. Simon tried to shout very loudly and call someone in the cave. The boys heard a rather loud mooing sound near them, so they hurried to that place. All this time they walked and were guided only by these strange sounds. Tony and Simon were surprised when they saw a tied-up girl in front of them. They were even less surprised when they realized it was Vanessa. Tony didn't understand how his friend ended up in this place because they had recently seen each other in the city. All this time, the company was being watched by the kidnappers, who were hiding in the shadows above. The guys rushed straight to the girl to help her free herself. However, Vanessa began to shake her head sharply from side to side, not letting them get any closer. Tony understood the girl's hint and stopped abruptly, almost falling into a trap. The boys immediately realized that they were not alone in the cave. Someone invisible kept attacking them, forcing the boys to dodge. Thanks to his perception, Tony could anticipate the attacks of his opponents and block them. Tony decided to combine his powers with his friends and free the girl. Simon immediately attacked where his new acquaintance pointed him. The kidnappers realized that with the boys' abilities like these, there was no longer any point in hiding. Immediately after that, they canceled their invisibility skill and showed themselves. Tony was able to sense several of his captors, which helped him escape death. Michael knew they were in for something serious if they were up against guys like that. The killers began to attack our guys, but they were not so simple. One of the kidnappers blocked our hero when the second attacked him from behind. However, they were prevented from striking by Simon, who knocked the kidnapper down. Immediately after this, he attacked the enemy with his most powerful fire. Then Simon saw that our hero, Tony, was already fighting with the second guy. He decided to help his partner and attacked another kidnapper with his fire. This distracted the enemy, allowing our hero, Tony, to attack him himself. The kidnappers started to run away, and Simon was going to pursue them. However, at the last moment, Tony suddenly grabbed him by the shoulder and stopped him. At that very second, another trap appeared right in front of them, into which Simon almost fell. The kidnappers even praised our guys for how capable they were in the dungeons. Simon realized that without Tony's help, he could have been dead several times over. Seeing such a strong enemy, the kidnappers decided to make some money on this as well. They intended to defeat the boys and use them in their terrible game. Tony realized that they were in serious trouble and they needed to stick together. So the guys joined forces and rushed to fight the kidnappers. At the same time, the head of the Fan Dillon family and Fan Chun entered the dungeon. By this time, several strong heroes had already rushed to him. However, the guys didn't have time to wait for the others, so they decided to move out first. The head of the Fan family and the traitor Chun entered the right portal ahead of everyone else. However, everything could not go so easily. This ruined all the plans of the heir. Fang Chong crushed the blocking crystal and used its abilities. Because of this, the rest of the heroes were unable to get inside the portal and into the dungeon. They immediately realized that it was a trap, and the entrance was now sealed for them. The head of the Fan family discovered human footprints in the middle of the snowy desert. He wondered why everyone else hadn't crossed the portal yet. However, he decided that the guys would sort it out themselves without him, and went ahead of everyone else. For some time, the head of the Fan Dillon family and Chun stood in front of the entrance to the cave. It was here that the tracks that the boys came across in the forest led them. Fang Chun tried to stop his boss and wait for everyone else. However, the man noted that he did not want to save his daughter, but to kill the kidnappers. Fan Chun was very surprised there that the man was not worried about the safety of his girl. Meanwhile, in the cave, our hero Tony was fighting with the real kidnappers. Simon fiercely covered his back and tried to take some of the blow. Michael was about to run for help, but something stopped him. The kidnappers immediately realized that the head of the Fan Dillon family himself had come to the cave. They immediately stopped fighting and tried to escape from the crime scene. The boys used their invisibility skill and disappeared from people's sight. At that very second, the head of the Fan family used his bare fists to make a passage in the cave. He saw Tony and Simon holding guns and Vanessa sitting tied up. The man was very surprised to see this company inside the cave. Fan Chun immediately started shouting that it was Tony who kidnapped the girl. Our hero had absolutely no idea what kind of nonsense he was talking about, so he objected. The head of the Fan family promised his daughter to save her, but the girl began to resist. Simon tried to explain that he had accidentally ended up in the cave while chasing other people. However, the girl's father did not listen to him because he was from a feuding family. The man was very angry, so he immediately used his body-strengthening technique. He immediately rushed into battle against Simon and Tony, whom he mistook for the kidnappers. The guys barely managed to get back at the last moment from his powerful blow. They jumped back the other way and tried to convince the man again. Simon knew he couldn't be reasoned with, so he decided to stop him first. The boy attacked the head of the Fan family with a fireball, but he blocked it. Immediately after this, the man struck our hero with such force that his sword broke into several pieces. Tony flew to the opposite end of the cave and crashed into a solid wall. The head of the Fan Dillon family did not hesitate for long and immediately began to attack further. Tony and Simon managed to combine their techniques and create a fiery whirlwind. Vanessa was worried that her father might be seriously injured in this battle. Simon apologized to the head of the family for making them counterattack him. However, this attack had no effect on the man. He easily got out of them. The head of the Fan family grabbed the heroes by the throat and threw them both onto the cold ground. The man squeezed Tony's neck hard, causing him to spit out some of the blood. The man was too strong for our hero, and now he was about to deliver the finishing blow. However, suddenly Vanessa's father became ill and began to have another attack. The girl was worried that her father's health was undermined by illness. Fan watched the situation and was happy with how well everything turned out. Tony was worried that the two of them had done too much damage to the man. However, at this moment, the head of the family remembered that Fan Chun had come with him. He turned around and noticed that one of his heirs was ready to attack the enemies. The next second, Fang Chong pierced the body of the head of the Fang family instead of the kidnappers. No one expected such a betrayal, so even the head of the family did not have time to do anything. He was seriously injured when he fell to the ground and was bleeding. The man suggested that Fan Chun was behind Vanessa's kidnapping along with the two guys. However, the guy said that they were not together and immediately began to attack further. The head of the Fan family gathered all his strength and once again rushed to attack the enemy. He intended to protect his only daughter at all costs. Fang Chong was amazed that even though he was injured, the head of the Fang family was incredibly strong. However, at that moment, a huge force pulled the master to the ground and destroyed the floor beneath him. These were the same three kidnappers who had been pretending to be invisible all this time. Only now did the head of the Fan family realize who the real traitor was here. It took several more applications of gravity to get the man to bow his head. The man was shocked that his potential successor had betrayed him. Fan Chun was about to kill Vanessa's father, so Vanessa closed her eyes in fear. However, he was prevented from doing this by a huge fire whirlwind. It was Tony and Simon who had joined forces again and were attacking their opponents. The kidnappers took the bloody battle with these young men upon themselves and ordered the failed heir to kill the head of the Fan family. The killers actively attacked our heroes and did not allow them to help Vanessa's father. At this time, he single-handedly confronted his subordinate, who turned out to be a traitor. Fang Chun decided to take the opportunity to attack his former boss. However, at that moment, Michael, whom everyone had completely forgotten about, appeared on the battlefield. The guy used his ability and made the kidnappers' bodies be attracted to him like a magnet. Fan Chun's attacks also flew towards Michael, surprising the guy. About halfway through the journey, the killers came under fire from their employer's attack, and an explosion occurred. Michael barely managed to jump to the side to avoid being caught in the explosion. Unfortunately, the guy couldn't repeat this move often because he used up too much energy. Now that the kidnappers were out of the hero's way, they attacked the air. The boys once again joined forces and sent a fiery whirlwind towards Fang Chong. The guy tried to defend himself with his own technique. She let him pass through the fiery whirlwind and headed towards the heroes. The boys barely managed to jump back in different directions before the fiery beam hit them. The impact was so powerful that the cave began to shake. Suddenly, one of the large appendages on the ceiling of the cave broke off and began to fall down. The head of the Fan family noticed that he was rushing straight towards his beloved daughter. The man gathered his strength and was able to keep the stone from falling on the girl. The head of the Fan family threw the cobblestone aside and straightened up. He apologized to his daughter for the fact that his body ended up being too ordinary. Immediately after this, the man fell down and Simon untied his daughter. Michael and Vanessa decided to take care of the head of the Fan family while he was unconscious. Vanessa asked why her old acquaintance and friend betrayed their family. Fan Chun noted that the public would only know that the family was attacked by bandits. The guy sincerely believed that his participation in this attack would remain unknown to anyone. This is precisely why he needed to kill everyone present. Fang Chong created a beam of enormous power and directed it straight towards Vanessa. However, Michael was able to use the remaining strength he had and change the trajectory of the attack. Now, instead of the girl, the beam was directed straight towards the guy. At the last moment, Tony managed to protect his friend and throw him to the ground. At this time, Simon immediately attacked Fang Chong with a fire attack. However, he managed to dodge it because he was a little faster. The guy noticed that even if the hero managed to avoid the attack, the cave would crush them. Simon was surprised that Fang Chun was willing to bury himself with them. However, the heir noticed that he had already called for help and would soon become a hero. Tony didn't want to die in that cave at all, so he asked Michael to come up with a plan. The man noted that even if they managed to get out of the cave, Vanessa and her father would not have time to do so. If the girl remains in the cave, they will definitely be recognized as traitors and will be persecuted. That's why Tony and Simon decided to defeat Fang Chun and escape unharmed. The heir was irritated that they were not paying attention to him and were talking among themselves. By this time, Michael had come up with a plan and Tony began to implement it. The young man tried to get closer to the enemy and avoid his attacks. Tony attacked Fan Chun while Michael helped him avoid the attacks. Hand-to-hand combat was not the traitor's strong point, but he was still skilled. At this time, Tony stopped fighting and decided to follow Michael's plan. Instead of attacking, our hero grabbed his opponent tightly by the wrists. After this, he gave a signal to his friend to begin the attack. Simon took his signal and began to concentrate his energy in one place. Fan Chun resisted as best he could and kicked our hero in the torso. He was horrified that Tony had decided to sacrifice himself to keep him. At that moment, Simon's attack came down on both of them, knocking them off their feet. However, Fang Chong was able to withstand the powerful attack of his fire and remained standing. The man found it funny that some newcomer expected him to be able to die with him. However, Tony used his doll substitution skills and ended up right behind his opponent. His plan was to use the substitution doll and attack the enemy continuously. The guys hoped to wear out their opponent so much that he would stop resisting. This is exactly why Simon attacked Fan Chun and Tony every time. The traitor knew that if the guys continued to aim straight at him, his strength would not last long, so he decided to counterattack them to win himself a small chance. The man gathered his remaining strength and began to throw balls of energy. However, because of all this, the guy did not notice how our hero was attacking him from behind. Tony used his enormous physical strength and literally carried his opponent to the exit of the cave. Because of this, the trajectory of his attack changed, and he broke through the ceiling of the cave. From a distance, it looked like a signal fire for reinforcements. One of the kidnappers pretended to be an assistant and told everyone else to go to the scene. At this time, the ceiling of the cave was destroyed. Everything around was in smoke. After some time, Fan Chong was able to get out of the rubble and catch his breath. He looked around and saw the remains of the cave he had recently been in. Fan Chong hoped that he could now become a hero and inherit the company. However, it turned out that all his opponents were still alive. Simon was impressed that Tony managed to cover him with his body, but he was still unharmed. The traitor was so angry that his plan had failed that he lost his temper. The man didn't understand why Tony couldn't just die and leave him alone. The young men began new battles after escaping from the cave. Fan decided to use the rest of his strength and finish off his opponent. However, Tony was quick enough to avoid every one of his attacks. He deftly dodged every beam of energy that his opponent tried to kill him with. It was at this time that Fan Chun paid attention to the fact that Vanessa and her father were left without protection. Then the guy decided to take advantage of the opportunity and kill them while they were weak. Tony immediately realized that he might not be able to save his friends. Fang Chong immediately prepared one of his most powerful attacks and aimed it towards Vanessa. The girl and Michael immediately raised the fact that they would not be able to avoid defeat. Tony tried to speed up as much as possible and managed to protect his friends. However, a huge explosion still occurred, raising a cloud of dirty dust into the air. When the smoke cleared, it turned out that Tony had managed to protect his friends after all. However, the guy served as a human shield and was seriously injured. Fang Chong had no intention of giving the guy a moment's rest and was about to attack him again. Vanessa was very worried that Tony would not be able to withstand so many attacks in a row. However, before the girl could finish speaking, another explosion of energy fell upon our hero. The wound in his body was so big that you could see right through it. Despite all his severe injuries, Tony still continued to stand on his feet. The last attack tore open his chest and tore off his arms. Fan Chong laughed wildly because he felt his undisputed victory was approaching. However, unexpectedly, our hero's body began to recover right before his eyes. Fang Chong hoped that he could surpass our hero's recovery skill. However, this time, Vanessa decided to help her friend and rushed to him. The girl wanted to protect him just as the guy had been protecting her all this time. She was also a hunter and yet possessed quite a lot of strength. She didn't allow her to fight, but served as a good shield for the girl. Vanessa's father recalled that before her death, his wife awarded their daughter with protective armor. After that, he shouted at Tony not to protect the girl, but to fight the traitor. He realized that his opponents outnumbered him and began to get nervous. Before he could do anything, Tony had already jumped up from his seat. Our hero rushed towards the enemy and intended to defeat him with his bare hands. Fan Chong easily stopped our hero's fist and avoided the blow. His body was of a very high rank, so the guy also possessed great strength. Fan was always proud that his body was like that of an S-rank hunter. However, even this did not help him resist the enormous strength of our hero. The traitor was amazed at how much power the newcomer possessed. At this time, the Fan family's bodyguards came running to the battlefield and were going to protect the traitor. However, Vanessa noticed that the men had got it all wrong. She said that it was the Fan who hired the kidnappers and threatened her family. Taking advantage of the general confusion, Fang Chong attempted to escape with his captors. The guys decided to use a special artifact and open a portal. This portal would allow them to be transported to any other location instantly. Tony tried to stop the traitor but did not have time to do so. Literally a second passed before the entire trio disappeared without a trace from the scene of the battle. Tom remembered the item he had gotten while fighting the turtle, which was supposed to help with the recovery. The guy didn't want the side effects of using the substitute doll to knock him out for 24 hours. At this time, they were joined by their older sister Lan, who was an excellent medic. Vanessa noticed that after the entire battle, she was safe and sound. Tony had also drunk his potion, so he felt just fine now. One of the guards approached the witch and asked her to activate the portal for movement. The girl looked at the condition of the rest of the fighters and decided to act immediately. She used the same portal through which the kidnappers left. This allowed the entire company to move directly to the hospital and provide first aid to the victims. Vanessa was worried about her father's condition, so she talked to doctors. She was told that the head of the family was in very serious condition and there was only one way to save him. However, the doctor refused to believe in traditional medicine and demanded that treatment be continued using classical methods. The hunter-magician was upset that doctors were desecrating the methods of his ancestors. Meanwhile, the rest of the company asked to let them go home since they were not involved in the kidnapping. The witch believed them, but wanted the head of the family to decide for himself what to do with them. Simon felt bad that they had saved so many people and were being treated so disgustingly. Tony noticed Lucy among the visitors and asked how the girl ended up there. A friend said that she was grabbed by bodyguards while they were looking for Tony. The young man didn't like the fact that his girlfriend suffered because of the traitor. Suddenly, the entire ward was filled with the beeping sound of a device that confirmed the death of the head of the family. Vanessa was terrified that her father could die right in his hospital bed. Then Lucy stepped forward and asked permission to try one method. Tony was worried that he had failed to hide his girlfriend's powers from the others. Vanessa was desperate, so she was ready to agree to anything. Then Lucy came close to the patient and directed a stream of her energy at him. After some time, the man's heartbeat returned to normal and he came to his senses. The man ordered that the witch be notified of the meeting to be held the next day. After this, the head of the family noted that he had to thank Tony and his friends for saving him. The man asked everyone except Tony and Vanessa to leave the room so he could talk to them. The next day, in the Great Hall, the head of the Fan family decided to make a loud announcement. He said that Fang Chong had colluded with their enemies and was expelled from the family. Subordinates immediately began to make noise and express their opinions on this matter. One of the girls was unhappy with this decision and remembered her last conversation with the traitor. The man then told her that he was forced to be with Vanessa because her father told him to. However, in reality, he sincerely loved the red-haired woman, which he confessed to her. That is why the girl was sure that Vanessa and Tony had set up her beloved. The head of the family announced that due to health reasons, he could not continue to manage the company. So he officially hands over the position of head of state to his daughter, Vanessa. All subordinates supported this decision because they sincerely respected the girl. After this, the man announced that Tony would become Vanessa's first deputy. This statement has already raised many questions among subordinates. A-rank Hunter Hinata stood up and said that she was against the appointment. Michael tried to say that Tony was an exceptionally gifted guy, so no one should be against it. However, there were those who agreed with the girl that the guy was too weak to be a successor. This caused a whole crowd of indignation among the subordinates who agreed with the claim. Hinata said that the head of the Fan family always judged people based on their talents and merits. At this point, Vanessa took the floor and stepped forward to speak in front of everyone. She allowed doubters to test Tony's strength for themselves. Hinata was expecting this, because the guy was supposed to be fought by a rather strong subordinate. The fighter jumped high into the air and was about to attack the hero with his signature technique. The next moment, Tony confronted his unexpected opponent and got into a fight. He delivered several super-fast punches to his opponent's body. After that, he threw the guy back several meters with one blow. He crashed hard into the hard wall and fell to the cold ground unconscious. Vanessa noticed that Tony used exactly the same technique against the traitor. The girl loudly announced that anyone could challenge him. At this time, Hinata was irritated that her friend had done such a poor job of his task. She announced that everyone would have to answer for harming her student. Tony was extremely disappointed that her student was so weak. Then the girl became furious and decided to attack him herself. However, another of her subordinates asked the girl to stop and choose a more opportune moment to attack. She didn't want to do this, but she still decided to listen to her subordinate. After this, the girl grabbed her student and dragged him away. One of Hinata's comrades apologized and quietly released his small weapon. It was a flying drone that could eavesdrop on everything around it. After this incident, the meeting ended and there were no objections to the new positions. Tony was sitting quietly and resting when Mike and Vanessa walked into his room. The girl thanked the guy for saving her and for supporting her. After this, our hero turned his attention to Michael, who continued to follow him closely. In fact, the guy wanted to offer our hero to assemble a team and explore the abandoned dungeon. The guys were surprised that they received this offer immediately after their return. Michael politely noted that now was the best time to grow his strength. Tony had absolutely no idea what was going on, so I had to explain it to him. Vanessa took the pointer in her hand and said that she would try to tell him everything from the very beginning. All over the world, the resources of the dungeon are limited. In their country, the dungeon is controlled by the authorities. However, the Fan family is a non-governmental organization, so it has its pros and cons. Organizations like them can obtain resources from the dungeons, but their distribution is completely controlled by the state. When after some time the resources of one dungeon are exhausted, then you need to move on to the next one. As a result, many non-governmental organizations are essentially in decline. This is why it is necessary to explore new abandoned dungeons that contain resource deposits. Tony answered honestly that he wasn't particularly interested. With these words, he greatly surprised Vanessa and Michael, who were counting on him. Michael literally rushed to beg his friend to help him explore the entire dungeon. However, Tony asked his friend not to throw a tantrum at him for no reason. He looked at one of the maps and asked why the route on it was so chaotic. Michael replied that someone had a need to lay out exactly that route. Tony couldn't look at this map calmly because of his illness. In this case, Michael decided to suggest to his friend to create a new route that would be ideal. Tony was inspired by this idea and decided to start converting the routes. He announced that he wanted to reach the western dungeons by the most direct route possible. Vanessa was glad that she quickly managed to persuade the guy to help. Meanwhile, the drone flew unnoticed towards the girl and hid among her hair. Thanks to this, the man learned that Tony was going to explore the abandoned dungeons in the west. Therefore, the girl decided to use the help of Damon, who knew those places well. S-rank Hunter Damon promised to make the boy pay for everything. A little later, Vanessa was sitting in her office looking through work documents. The girl discovered a file with an investigation into Fang Chun's betrayal. At this time, Vanessa's father, who was recovering from the incident, entered the office. Vanessa asked him to look at the documents their investigators had collected. It turned out that on almost all issues, the traitor contacted their enemies. Suddenly, the head of the Fan family sharply hit the girl on her tender and fragile neck. Vanessa didn't understand why her father behaved this way towards her. The man then showed the girl a small drone which he destroyed. This meant that someone had been eavesdropping and had learned information about Tony's plans. At this time, Hinata reported to Fan Chun about where our hero was going to go. She announced that she was going to infiltrate Damon into the guy's squad. The remaining 3 were to lie in ambush and attack the group at its moment of weakness. Fan Chun had made a great plan, so now everyone had to play their roles. The man hoped that this time he would be able to defeat his opponent. After some time, Michael and Tony were moving straight towards the western dungeon. The guys arrived at the first post on their way and saw a small portal. Michael had never been to this place before, so he would have preferred to gather a larger group. Tony was upset that the guy was only thinking about it now. However, Michael noted that they could find partners for themselves in the dungeon itself, among the other hunters. It was at this moment that Damon appeared, who was already waiting for the guys here. He stood on top of the building that housed the portal to the dungeon. The man pushed off the roof and jumped to the ground right in front of our heroes. He introduced himself as a local free hunter and invited the boys to join him. Tony didn't know the man, so he was strongly against his participation. However, Damon noted that he had been working in these parts for a long time and knew the area well. However, our hero didn't like how dirty the traveler was. Hinata watched from ambush and didn't understand why the group of people were taking so long. Michael noted that they really needed a partner who knew the area well. It was only because of this that the young man agreed to travel with Damon. In fact, the hunter didn't like the way Tony reacted to his appearance. Only after this did the guys decide to get to know each other and introduce themselves. Once the greetings and handshakes were over, the 3 of them entered the portal. Hinata ordered her partners to watch the exit and wait for the travelers to appear. And at this time, the Trinity came out from the other side of the portal and found themselves in the dungeon. Michael was surprised when he saw that they had entered a deserted dungeon. Suddenly, 3 desert enemies appeared right in front of our travelers. Damon volunteered to be the first to fight these monsters and stepped forward. He pulled his long sword from its sheath and promised that he would deal with the monsters. The guy really did defeat all 3 opponents in the blink of an eye. Immediately after this, they crumbled into small particles and scattered into the air. Michael was extremely impressed with how strong their new partner was. Damon admitted that he was just warming up and did not show his full strength. After the monsters disappeared, several artifacts appeared in their place. However, suddenly, several more soldiers appeared right in front of Tony. Damon said that if the root of evil is not destroyed, they will continue to appear. This was the key mechanism of the sand dungeon that worked everywhere. In fact, he knew that the hidden boss was the tree behind them. Tony clarified whether the monster will really continue to update itself over and over again. Michael immediately understood what his friend with OCD was getting at. Hours later, Tony continued to fight the monsters that kept appearing before them. Michael explained to him that the battle allowed his friend to collect bonuses endlessly. That's why Tony kept fighting every monster that appeared before him. Immediately after this, boxes with artifacts that our hero needed appeared from them. At this time, robbers were waiting for them outside who were already frozen. The guys didn't understand why the team spent so much time in the dungeon. One of the boys went out in the middle of the night to replenish their supplies as the wait was getting too long. The night was ending and the sun would soon rise, but Tony was still fighting. He continued to hone his skills on the endlessly respawning monsters. Damon had no idea how long the guy was going to do this. However, Michael noticed that his friend would not stop until he collected all possible bonuses. The hunter had never encountered anything like this before because they already had a whole mountain of boxes. He knew that if the boy continued to fight, he would not have the opportunity to attack him. That's why Damon decided to take the whole situation into his own hands. He pulled out his sword and let out a loud cry, which attracted the attention of the guys. The traitor decided to first end the quest and then attack Tony. The swordsman knew that he had to defeat the tree and destroy the lantern at its top. It was at this moment that a hidden boss appeared, which was supposed to put an end to the test. The tree began to constantly attack the man who dared to disturb it. It was at this moment that our hero Tony noticed that there was a hidden boss in the dungeon. Damon just pretended that he was hearing about this for the first time and that he himself didn't know. The tree quickly became active and was about to attack our heroes. In fact, huge and powerful roots were hidden under this sand. The last time Tony combined his power with Simon, he had a thought. In order to be prepared for anything in the dungeon, you need to have items of different elements with you. He sincerely hoped that he had not accidentally revealed his knowledge about this boss. At this time, Tony mercilessly chopped with his sword at the tree roots that were emerging from under the sand. The guy took his favorite lighter and threw it straight towards the dry tree. The lighter landed right in the monster's mouth and sank deep inside. Immediately after this, the tree began to swell and reached incredible sizes, after which it burst and shattered into a million very small pieces. In place of the monster, a dusty curtain formed, hiding everything behind it. However, instead of being completely destroyed, the monster became even larger and stronger. During the fall, Damon injured his leg and thanked Tony for saving him. The guy was very happy to help the man because he considered them to be one team. Damon decided to repay the guy a favor since he saved him. The boys saw how the tree was growing in size again and gaining its power. Michael suggested that this boss has a mode for close and long-range attacks. However, Damon noticed that the tree had rather weak defense in close combat. He said that all you have to do is pick the right moment and finish him off. However, the man noted that if they failed, they would not have time to hide from the explosion. Tony immediately understood what he meant and decided to give it his all. The boys waited for the moment when the tree attacked them and used this opportunity. They dodged the blow and tried to get closer to him. At that very moment, the tree released its powerful and huge roots from under the sand. Damon said he would grab the outer branches to distract the monster and trigger an explosion. After this, he began to chop various branches and roots of the tree at great speed. Meanwhile, Tony rushed forward and began to attack the monster itself. Michael took advantage of his opportunity and began to lure the tree branches. This allowed us to buy some time for our hero Tony to advance. The tree continued to relentlessly attack its opponents with balls of energy. However, Tony miraculously managed to break through and get close to the tree. The guy thrust his sword into its trunk with force and decided to cut it into pieces. Tony slashed at the monster in various places with great speed. Immediately after the blow, the guy ran a decent distance and joined his friends. Because it was at this moment that the tree began to smoke and threatened to explode. The boys hoped that they were at quite a large distance from the monster. At that moment, a huge explosion occurred, which created a shockwave. This time, the heroes managed to completely destroy the lantern, which was the heart of the monster. After this, the guys were thrown in different directions by the blast wave. After the smoke cleared, they saw the remains of the defeated monster in front of them. The system announced that the task had been completed simply perfectly. After this, the huge rotten body of the monster began to disappear and turn into dust. It dropped a reward that allowed the creation of a zero-gravity area with a diameter of about 100 m. Damon was immensely glad that their ordeal was over and offered to leave. After the guy paid off his debt, he could kill Tony again. However, our hero continued to move forward all the time, not giving anyone a rest. Immediately after that, the guys went to the next dungeon because Tony wanted to clear them all. After some time, he easily killed the dragon and again completed the task perfectly. After this, they fought with the Egyptian god, who confirmed them in the temple. They also easily defeated him and left, taking all the trophies that were due to them. In this way, the guys conquered every dungeon that came their way. Damon and Michael were impressed by the skills of their partner, with whom they went on the journey. Michael noticed that they had one last dungeon left, judging by the map. Tony was glad that he could get it over with and go home. After some time, the guys arrived in a city inhabited by strange people. A little ahead, near the fountain, they noticed a beautiful girl surrounded by men. It was a blonde in a pink dress who was incredibly beautiful. Right before our hero's eyes, a huge evil dragon attacked the city. He quickly grabbed the girl with his clawed paws and lifted her into the air. The dragon stole a local beauty and quickly flew away from this city with her. The boys asked the men in the square what had just happened. Michael noted that all of these scenes definitely looked like they were scenes from a game. However, Damon was very surprised that he had seen these people before. The townspeople asked the strangers if they wanted to kill the dragon and save the princess. A huge, evil red dragon roared loudly and opened its mouth wide. Immediately after this, a huge column of bright fire burst into the sky. The dragon was furious and went to fight the stranger who dared to disturb his peace. It was our hero Tony who was carrying out his next difficult task. The dragon was far from simple. He possessed enormous magical power. The monster could increase in size and attack with physical force. Thanks to his speed, Tony managed to avoid the blow and climb up the monster's huge arm. The young man jumped on the dragon as if it were a springboard for him. Damon and Michael were impressed by our hero's incredible speed and agility. Tony had almost reached the very top when he pulled out his favorite sword. After this, he slew the dragon, which impressed the locals. Michael realized that the old man was speaking as if he were not a game character from a computer game. Tony noticed that Damon looked like he had seen a ghost. Suddenly, the man stepped away from them and loudly announced that he had met his son. Many years ago, his son went to explore the Western Dungeon, but has since disappeared without a trace. All these years, he searched for his son, but the locals did not recognize him. Damon was disappointed because he thought he had finally found his child. Tony asked the guy to stop crying and wipe his snot because it looked disgusting. After this, the elder handed Damon some small package. It turned out to be a compressed magic carpet that was growing in size. The man took out a bag and threw it into the water of the fountain to demonstrate. After a few moments, the carpet absorbed the moisture and suddenly increased in size. Our hero Tony did not understand where such a strange phenomenon came from in the dungeon. Michael didn't understand how a non-player character in the dungeon could be Damon's biological son. Even Tony noted that the man really does look like the game character, and they go through the story. Tony walked up to the man and began to examine him from all sides, which confused Michael. The hero noticed that the man did not react at all to his actions and was playing his role. The local resident was simply reciting lines that had been given to him in advance. Michael noticed that everyone they had met in the dungeon before had interacted with them in some way. Tony wondered if anyone else had encountered this problem before. So Tony suggested killing the local boss first and then dealing with this strange plot. The guys climbed onto the flying carpet and went straight to the lair of the local boss. They didn't notice that someone was watching them closely all this time. It was the same little drone that had been watching Vanessa before. At this time, outside the dungeon, Hinata and her small group made a fire. The girl woke up only because her phone was constantly ringing loudly. It turned out to be Fan Chun, who wanted to find out the results of the mission. The man was angry because he still had not received any reports or results. He didn't understand why such a simple task was taking them so long. Hinata explained that Damon entered the dungeon, but no one came out. Fang Chong was angry that the three were having fun and clearing the dungeon. He ended the conversation and said that he would definitely come back to this later. Hinata asked her subordinates if they really couldn't let Tony through. One of the guys noticed that they had been watching the entrance all night and no one had come out. At this time, Fan Chun returned and said that Tony's company had reached the westernmost dungeon. After this, he ordered the company to enter the dungeon and help deal with the hero. Sometime later, an SUV was racing through the desert at great speed. The car stopped and Vanessa herself climbed out of the driver's seat. Following close behind her was her friend Lucy, who intended to help the girl. She didn't understand why she couldn't help her childhood friend Tony. The head of the Fan family was in his office looking through the company's reports. Suddenly, he found something strange in the documents, so he decided to pay attention to it. The man wanted to go with Tony's company to help in the dungeon. However, suddenly an unknown man in a cloak appeared behind the leader and threatened him. The stranger put a gun to the man's throat and ordered him to do nothing. He had no intention of killing him, but ordered that the western dungeon be left alone. The head of the Fan family was unhappy that he was forbidden to use the common dungeons. Then the stranger threatened that he could kill the man if he did not listen to him. The head of the Fan family did not want to give up and immediately decided to increase his physical strength. He decided to attack this strange guy in a dark cloak first. However, the man only had to snap his fingers to stop the leader. Immediately after this, the man was immediately cut into several pieces. Meanwhile, Tony and company were flying on a magic carpet over the desert. The boys flew between the gorges, sometimes going down, sometimes going up again. After some time, the flying carpet simply dropped the guys to the ground. Damon was disappointed with himself because he was supposed to spy on the guys, but he joined them. The boys landed on the ground and saw the entrance to the cave right in front of them. Judging by the surroundings, the dragon definitely had a fire element. The boys tried to sneak into the cave as carefully and unnoticed as possible. There, on a pedestal in the middle of the lava, stood a girl who was chained. Damon was glad that it was not enough for him to free the princess and complete the dungeon. However, Tony's hero believed that a trap awaited them and that everything would not be so simple. The girl had obviously been hung up for them as bait, and the enemy was nowhere to be seen. Damon got too close to the fragile edge and almost fell off the cliff into the lava. Michael tried to shout to the young girl and check whether she was alive or not. The girl did not answer them but shook her head and mumbled something. Suddenly, to attract the girl's attention, someone threw a stone at her head. Michael didn't understand how it was possible to treat a hostage who was tied up so terribly. However, Tony noticed that the girl was just a game character, so she didn't feel anything. Suddenly, the floor beneath them turned into a dragon's tail and began to move. It turned out that all this time, the dragon was pretending to be made of stone and was right in front of them. After waking up, he flew up and was about to attack the heroes. Tony was glad that the boss had quickly shown himself and the battle was about to begin. The dragon did not wait long and immediately decided to attack our heroes with his fire. The guys didn't have time to figure anything out before a fiery force immediately rose up towards them. Tony managed to jump to the side at the last moment to avoid being hit by the attack. Damon and Michael also barely managed to escape from the scene of the attack of this huge monster. With one blow, the dragon destroyed most of the land and their safe place. The floor under the heroes' feet began to tremble and gradually crumbled lower and lower. At some point, Michael lost his footing and began to fall into the abyss. He shouted very loudly to quickly attract the attention of his friends. Tony noticed his dear partner fall and immediately extended his hand to him. At the last moment, the guy managed to grab Michael by the hand and grab the edge of the cliff himself. However, this was a very dangerous situation because the dragon was preparing to attack again. Damon realized that he would have to help this company again and repay his debt. Immediately after this, the guy used the technique and caused a gust of wind. With this gust of wind, he was able to lift his partners out of the gorge. The boys were incredibly grateful to Damon for helping them get out. The boys almost forgot about the dragon himself, who was very angry. Michael used his powers and tried to attract the monster's attention to himself. He succeeded. The dragon left Tony alone and turned his attention to the guy. This allowed our hero to deliver several lightning-fast attacks to the dragon. The guy climbed up and prepared to deliver the decisive blow to the monster's head. Tony noticed a bright red cross on the dragon's forehead, which he aimed to hit. The guy sincerely believed that this place would be the most vulnerable for him. However, instead of defeating the monster, it only made him even more angry. Damon watched Tony's battle from the sidelines, doing nothing. Suddenly, our hero fell loudly like a stone right next to him on the ground. Tony was bruised, but pleased that he had found his opponent's weak spot. Immediately after this, the three of them decided to attack the monster and hit the mark on its head. The guys dispersed throughout the cave and each began to do his own thing. Michael's main task was to distract the dragon, and Tony and Damon to attack it. The boys moved at the same time so that the dragon could not follow one of them. Still, the monster was too strong, so even they needed help from the outside. Michael used his power and was able to hold the monster in place. Because of this monster, I felt pressure on myself and could not move. However, this effect did not last long because the dragon was too large. But this time was enough for Tony to get to the right place. Damon also approached the mark on the monster's head and prepared to attack it. The boys simultaneously put their knees together and hit the mark on the monster's head. The blow was so powerful that the monster's skull literally folded in half. After this, the dungeon boss was defeated and should have started to disappear. The dragon fell to the hard ground as his body gradually evaporated. After a few moments, it completely disappeared, leaving only the artifact in its place. Michael couldn't believe that they defeated this huge monster so easily and simply. Tony wondered why the standard reward didn't appear after defeating the boss. Instead, in front of them lay some strange gray cube with wires. Tony took this strange object in his hands and began to examine it from all sides. Suddenly, the cube in his hands began to move in different directions and emit electricity. Our hero was surprised and accidentally dropped the artifact, which rolled away. A few moments later, it fell apart, and strange red smoke appeared in its place. The boys were distracted by the loud voice of the princess, who was calling them for help. The young girl came to her senses and began actively calling our heroes to her. The boys immediately rushed to the princess to quickly free her from captivity. However, suddenly the girl stopped calling for help and laughed maliciously. A moment later, her face was distorted, and in its place appeared the face of a monster. Our hero, Tony, immediately realized that this was the catch of this dungeon. Instead of a neat princess, there was a monster with a huge head in front of them. Tony immediately rushed forward to protect his friends from the monster's attack. He managed to knock them to the ground and avoid death from the monster's huge paws. The guy quickly got to his feet and looked at what he would have to fight this time. Instead of a head, the girl had a huge neck and a toothy mouth. The monster was still chained to the rock and could not move. After a few moments, the monster's head shrank and returned to its normal size. He again took the form of a beautiful girl and began to laugh at the boys. Tony thought that this was the hidden boss of this dungeon. Michael didn't understand how his friend came to this conclusion, because they had never encountered anything like this before. Tony explained that in all the other dungeons they first defeated the monster and then got the reward. However, in this dungeon they defeated the boss, but the reward still did not drop. Now it was clear why many of the unfortunate people who went in search of the princess never returned. Damon mentally praised our hero because without him he would have died long ago. Meanwhile, the princess continued to laugh and looked at the boys with malicious glee. The girl admitted that Tony was the first one who was able to guess her true nature. It was indeed the hidden S-rank boss, Jenny, who no longer hid her powers. The girl actively controlled her chains and attacked her opponents with them. She wanted to finish off our hero first, so she headed towards him. At the last moment, Tony managed to jump aside and avoid the fatal blow. However, the girl was not going to give up and attack the guy again and again. Suddenly, she stopped and looked like she was about to spit something out. A moment later, the girl opened her mouth and some kind of purple poisonous substance poured out of it. Michael and Damon decided to work together again, distracting the girl. Michael used his power again and changed the trajectory of the poison. The purple substance got on his hands, with which the boy covered his face. However, a second later, he screamed in pain because his hands were severely burned. The guy dropped his hands down because he was unable to move them. Damon immediately rushed to Michael's aid because he was very vulnerable. Now he considered himself indebted to this chubby guy and wanted to protect him. The man understood perfectly well that he was not able to deal with the monster on his own. That's why he was left alone with Michael and our hero went to fight. The guy just wanted to protect his friend, so he tried to help him. Tony noticed that the monster's chains were of different lengths. The guys both thought that the guy was being distracted again due to his OCD. However, Michael suggested that there might be a good reason for all this. He remembered that the long chain was for long-range attacks and the short one for close-range ones. Damon said he could neutralize the monster's attacks from a distance. In that case, Tony decided that he would hold off on attacks at close range. A great idea on how to defeat the monster immediately appeared in our hero's head. The boss noted that no matter what plan they came up with, they would not be able to win. But our heroes did not listen to the monster, but agreed on how to fight further. At this time, the monster decided to attack with its long chain from a long distance. Damon also summoned his own fire whirlwind and immediately blocked her attack. Because of this, the monster's chain got caught inside the vortex and could not get out of it anywhere else. The girl was handcuffed on one hand but could still control the other. At this time, Tony attacked her, taking on the close combat. The princess immediately attacked her enemy with her second hand, which held a short chain. The blow was so strong that the monster thought he had already won in one go. But Tony stood firm. He was strong and could always compensate for any damage with his replacement doll. The monster encountered such an opponent for the first time, so she was surprised by his strength. The girl was preparing to spit out another dose of poison, but Tony had a secret weapon for this case. He took out of his pocket a compact flying carpet that a local resident had given him. Just before the monster attacked, the guy threw the bag with all his might right into her mouth. The shrunken carpet fell right into the monster's poison that she was about to spit out. Damon and Michael were impressed by Tony's unusual strategy. Because of this carpet, the girl could not spit out her poison and looked as if she was ill. While she was distracted and unable to move, Tony decided to act. He immediately crept up to the girl and lightning fast dealt her several cutting blows. After this, the girl's body fell apart into several pieces and the real reward appeared. It was exactly the same cube with wires that they had seen before. However, now it was real because the hidden boss of the dungeon had been defeated. The artifact immediately began to glow and make strange sounds while it lay on the ground. The dungeon beneath our heroes' feet and around them began to crack and fall apart. A huge column of smoke and dust rose up due to the collapse of rocks from all sides. After that, the boys waited until the curtain cleared and they could look around. Suddenly, instead of a cave, they found themselves in some kind of huge warehouse or laboratory. The huge doors right in front of them opened, letting the travelers into the building. The three of them quickly entered the laboratory and tried to look around. The boys noticed that there were people in huge glass tanks ahead of them. In one of them, Damon noticed the body of his son, whom he met in the city. Tony looked around and realized that he had never seen such a strange dungeon before. It was more like a laboratory where monsters were grown. If you look at the map, this is where the border from the westernmost dungeon should end. That's why the guys didn't know where they were now. Suddenly, Damon screamed loudly and fell to the ground, which scared the boys a lot. During this fall, the guy felt as if he suddenly remembered something. Damon said he had 1,000 visions flashing through his mind that he had previously lost. Many years ago, this was a region with dungeons for free exploration. Here, the territory under the country's control ended and the free one began. But then the country's military took over this place and research stopped. They wanted to take these territories in order to conduct their experiments here. The military made these dungeons experimental, using local residents for this purpose. Damon remembered that this was actually the first artificial dungeon. Behind all this stood the country's first military leader, S-rank hunter Gregory. Meanwhile, outside the dungeon, Vanessa and Lucy were driving in a car towards the portal. The girls had absolutely no idea why the signal was so bad in this place. They were driving through the desert and saw Hinata and her company nearby. Lucy didn't expect to meet any acquaintances in the middle of the desert, so she was surprised. However, Vanessa did not attach much importance to this and decided not to stop. In fact, at this time, Hinata and her company were talking with Fang Chun. The man was very angry with them because his subordinates had lost their target. What angered him was that the boys couldn't cope with even such a simple task. However, at this time, the man was distracted by his boss, who burst into the office. Gregory announced that the travelers had discovered his experimental site and that Fan Chun had failed his mission. The man begged for another chance, but his boss didn't listen. Immediately after that, Fan Chong's loud cry was heard and the connection with him was cut off. Hinata realized that something strange was happening and was worried about her beloved. Meanwhile, in the corporation's office, Gregory attacked his subordinate. It pierced his left arm and shoulder and wrapped its tentacles around his body. Gregory said that he had already given the guy his power, so he needed to kill everyone in the experimental dungeon. A few moments later, Fang Chong contacted his subordinates again and frightened them with his appearance. The guy was half naked and various wires and pipes were sticking out of his body. He gave his subordinates the order to exterminate them and then hastily disappeared. At this time, our company was in the experimental laboratory and discussed what we saw. Michael was worried that they had wandered into secret military territory and needed to escape. However, Tony believed that this was an excellent field for research. Suddenly, the alarm went off, the alarm blared loudly, and the lights went out. The door quickly slammed behind our heroes, cutting off their escape. Immediately after this, all the capsules were opened, and green liquid poured out of them onto the floor. The enslaved people began to slowly emerge from their capsules one by one. They looked as if they were not aware of their actions and were moving according to someone else's will. Our heroes had nowhere to retreat, so they had to fight. Suddenly, a strange sound was heard from above, and the ceiling began to move apart in different directions. Some modern structure descended right in front of our heroes. Michael immediately recognized the spatial teleporter, which was a key technology of the military. It didn't look like a reward for clearing a dungeon at all. A bright light poured out of this teleport, then a huge capsule fell to the floor. A few moments later, the doors opened and gray smoke began to pour out from inside. Then their old friend Fan Chun came out from there, who caused the guys a lot of trouble. Only now he looked much stronger and more terrible, merging with the monster. It felt like the force was tearing this guy's body apart from the inside. Now our trio of heroes confronted Fan Chun and the enslaved people. Tony had no idea what they should do in this situation. Damon looked at his customer and didn't understand why he came in person. The guy didn't want to show his cards and fight with his partners, who had saved him more than once. At this time, Tony woke up from his stupor and addressed his opponent by name. The guy thought that Fan Chun had come to finish the fight they had started earlier. However, Michael stopped his friend and said that the enemy was more like local test subjects. He noticed Fang Chong's eyes, which were shining red and looked strange. It seemed as if it was not Fan Chun, but a real monster. The next moment, the enslaved people rushed to attack our heroes. Damon had to fight with his own son, whom he had not seen for a long time. The guy didn't want to harm him, but to find a way to save him. That's why Damon decided not to kill the man, but simply knock him out. Immediately after that, he threw the man's body onto his shoulder and supported him. Now it was time to fight with the rest of the villagers. Michael noticed that the others went crazy as soon as Fang Chun's eyes turned red. So the guys realized that they had to eliminate their main enemy first. Michael distracted all the other monsters, and Tony quickly rushed past them. His main goal was to attack Fang Chong himself first. Our hero did not understand why his old opponent had suddenly become so slow. The boy brought his sword down on him, but Fang Chong easily blocked it with his bare hands. Immediately after this, the huge pipes in his body began to move and wriggle. It turned out that the young man could control them at will. The pipes acted like tentacles and also allowed them to attack opponents. Because of this, Tony even had to move away quite a decent distance. The young man did not understand how his old acquaintance had turned into such a monster. In one instant, the situation around the boys suddenly changed dramatically. Now they were not inside the laboratory, but inside some kind of light box. From behind Fang Chong, tentacles began to emerge, holding weapons within them. It was as if the guy had turned into one huge computer, which he could use at will. All the parts came together to form one huge weapon that resembled a cannon. All this time, a hidden camera was watching the battle between these opponents. Someone stood in front of a huge screen and controlled everything that was happening through a remote control. The man could simultaneously watch the battle inside the dungeon and what was happening outside. Thanks to his screens, he could find out all the information about the people who were in his field of vision. At this point, Vanessa still had practical value to this man, so he decided to focus on observing what was happening inside the dungeon. At this time, our three were still fighting with the enslaved people and our former partner. Fan Chun activated his cannon and was about to attack our heroes with it. In just one short moment, he released a blast of incredible energy. At the last moment, hunters Tony and Michael managed to dodge the projectile. Fang Chong became more and more crazy and looked like a real monster. He continued to constantly attack his former acquaintances and did not give them a break. Even our hero Tony had a hard time coping with that kind of intensity. The guy was incredibly tired from the constant movement and was breathing very heavily. Due to the characteristics of the surface that surrounded them, the blows were reflected off them. Because of this, the trajectory was extremely unpredictable and it was more difficult to dodge. Tony noticed that Fan Chun did not spare his men and hit them. He could have been aiming at Tony and then accidentally hit one of his assistants. This partly helped our heroes because they didn't have to dodge the monster's attacks separately. However, the trajectory of the projectile's fall was still unpredictable and dangerous. Tony wondered if his friend Michael had had time to come up with any ideas. The guy knew that they wouldn't be able to dodge the laser projectiles ricocheting off the walls of the enclosed space for long. That's why the guys hoped that they would have at least a couple of moments to rest. Suddenly, Tony jumped out of his seat and ran straight towards his opponent. He noticed that after turning into a monster, his opponent became much slower. If so, he could use his own speed and win. So Tony kicked Fan Chun to the ground with all his might, exposing him to the blow of his own weapon. His plan worked perfectly, and his former colleague ended up right under the blast of his own weapon. Immediately after this, a huge explosion was heard inside the room. The shock wave threw all the heroes aside and slammed them hard into the ground. After some time, the boys were able to come to their senses and get back on their feet. However, through the smoke screen, they saw that someone was still standing. After a few moments, the smoke cleared, and it turned out that Fan Chong was safe and sound. Michael noted that they barely managed to cope with one blow, but it was not a fact that they would be so lucky again. Tony said he wanted to try to bring one of his ideas to life. Immediately after this, the guy took a fighting stance and began to wait for his chance. He watched closely as Fang Chong fired another projectile from his weapon. Immediately after this, our hero Tony snuck up and crawled right under him. He raised his sword high above his head and brought down a blow of enormous force on him. His opponent didn't even have time to do anything against his nimble actions. That's why Tony was able to cut off the monster's arms with such ease. Immediately after this, the young man stopped, turned around, and ran in the other direction. Tony suddenly noticed that the monster's skin was capable of reflecting the laser charge itself. That's why he decided to use this power and test its capabilities. Fang Chong was furious at the loss of his arm and prepared to shoot again. He readied his weapon and then fired another high-power laser blast. This time, Tony swung and hit him with the monster's hand, not his sword. The projectile bounced off the limb perfectly and went exactly in the opposite direction. Immediately afterwards, another deafening explosion occurred as the shell hit its target. In this way, they managed to defeat the traitor Fan Chun, but the guys did not know what to do next and how to get out of this strange dungeon.